This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with James O'Brien.
Good morning, it's 4 minutes after 10 and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I hope you had a good weekend. Obviously, if you've got family in Israel, then it would have been one of the worst imaginable, I imagine. And that's where we begin our conversation this morning. I wish we didn't have to. I can't lie. I don't know what to say. It doesn't happen to me very often. But I don't know that there is a immediate parallel or precedent to be drawn here. I mentioned a moment ago that the simple thought of being in the middle of a rave, of being dancing away, and then to find yourself under fire, hundreds shot, young people carted away, one woman on the back of a motorbike screaming, "Please don't kill me." It is hard to imagine a more violent reversal of circumstance. I know all terror attacks come from the same place, as it were, the determination to inflict terror, not just to kill, but to terrorize. They're two different but inextricable things. And I know the violence of that reverse is crucial. I don't know why I found myself thinking of the Ariana Grande concert in Manchester quite a lot while reading some of the reportage coming out of Israel over the weekend. Partly, I think, because of that sense of absolute destruction, to go from the happiest you can be, in a way, to terrorized, the most terrorized you can be in every way is almost impossible to contemplate. And that, I think, is why perhaps I'd rather not contemplate it. You'd rather not even think about it. And then you get the inevitable, and I don't know if everything was like this before social media kicked off or grew into what it has subsequently become. You get the inevitable attempts to turn anything into a kind of vendetta. So who do you hate most? Okay, let's use the situation in Israel. Let's use these terror attacks to go after the people you hate the most already. And it cuts in almost every direction, you know. I saw something on Twitter today suggesting that you have to, if you're trying to sort of tie in Brexit with, even I would balk at, well, Nash, I'm not even going to say that. I'm not going to turn it into a joke. There's sort of people, I think someone said to me something like, you must condemn Hamas like you condemn Brexit. And you just sort of think, how can you? Some people will use it as an opportunity to attack the BBC. Some people will use it as an opportunity to attack Keir Starmer for not having resigned from Jeremy Corbyn's shadow cabinet. I don't get that, actually. You'd think I would, wouldn't you? It does indeed, a text already coming in, have echoes of that Bataclan theatre attack in Paris as well. There's something about these terrorists, isn't there, that they really hate young people having fun. They really hate happy young people. It's really odd, that. It's almost as if that is, in some sense, a distillation of something, you know, a body of young humans dancing together in a big space. The targeting of that speaks about more than logistics, doesn't it? It's a targeting of an emotion, almost. It's a targeting of happiness. But the immediate reaching for personal or previous vendettas, people that you had a problem with, or institutions that you had a problem with before the events of this weekend, and then the events of this weekend unfold and you think, oh, well, I'll use this to have a crack at the people that I had a problem with before the events of this weekend unfolded. That's why I find it hard to know what to talk about today, or obviously we know what we're talking about, but I find it hard to know precisely what angle to take, because it's so bizarre, isn't it? The way in which it almost immediately turns into previous grievances, previous vendettas, as opposed to just horror at what's been done, boundless sympathy for the dead, the injured, and the terrorised, and I mean, infinite compassion for the innocents who are now going to die in droves on both sides of that border, both sides of that wall. It's almost unthinkable. The other word that occurred to me, because you heard some people on Nick's show contextualizing, if that's the right word to use, and pointing out that the Gaza Strip is, I think, internationally recognised as one of the world's biggest prisons, biggest open prisons. But the the notion of something being indefensible, inexcusable, and unjustifiable. I wonder whether it's ever possible for everybody to agree that something they are watching is indefensible, inexcusable, unjustifiable. Those are the three words I think that we'll run with this morning. Indefensible, inexcusable, unjustifiable. I remember when I first started taking calls about Islamist terrorism in the West after September the 11th. I wasn't here for September the 11th, but there were, of course, plenty of other attacks, atrocities that unfolded in its wake. You know, pound for pound, this is worse than September the 11th for Israelis. If you look at the number of dead and the overall population, I read somewhere this morning in percentage terms that it's actually worse. The kind of the notion of indefensibility is the one that I find hardest to swallow, actually. Would we ever all agree? Would the whole world ever agree that something is indefensible? But when I first started taking calls about Islamist terrorism, here it is, here's Greg in Yorkshire. I never hear this type of outrage when Israel attacks Palestine. You're not hearing outrage from me at the moment. You might do later, Greg. You're just hearing heartbreak, absolute heartbreak. That things are going to get a heck of a lot worse before, and indeed if they ever get better. But how does it work like that? How does this whataboutery work? Hundreds of people have been killed, kidnapped, murdered. And your response is to say, yeah, but what about that over there? What about this? As if it somehow dilutes the horror of what we're contemplating or excuses the behaviour of the people who've inflicted the horror. That's what I mean about unjustifiable, indefensible. You don't agree with me. You don't agree with me that it's unjustifiable. It is indefensible. You think that it's important to point out that terrible experiences are visited upon Palestinian people in Gaza. Just leave it for now. But you can't. So I first started taking calls, and people would always say, but. And I couldn't quite believe it. Listen, this is a weird job, right? I enjoyed some of the reflections over the weekend on the 50th anniversary of commercial radio in general and LBC in particular. And it occurred to me, it's a really weird job, not for the first time. But one of the weirdest things about it is that most days I have to sit here. Well, I love sitting here. I don't want to make it sound like a chore. But it's important that I sound like I know what I'm talking about. Yeah? It's important that even if I'm wrong about something, I've got a relatively robust line on it that we can then pick over together. It becomes a sort of invitation to conversation. And there are days when, I mean, there aren't many. In fact, I can't remember the last one. I was fine on the morning after the Manchester attack because I just imagined I'd been there with one of my girls and spoke about it from the heart. I can't quite imagine this. Lots of people listening can. Lots of people listening don't even need to imagine it because they are living it at the moment. We have a lot of listeners in the Middle East, in Israel in particular, I think. But it's the indefensibility. It's when people started saying to me, Western foreign policy. Oh, of course I condemn the attack on the London Underground on July the 7th, but Western foreign policy and wars in the Middle East sponsored by the West have caused more problems than they've solved in the main, but that wasn't the initial intention when they started. Tony Blair, sort of high on the Kosovan success, thought he'd be able to visit similar results on other parts of the world, and no doubt ruse the day he decided to try. But it's the notion of indefensibility that I can't quite get my head around today. How can this just not be unjustifiable, indefensible, unthinkable? And there may be consequences of it visited upon entirely innocent people in Gaza that will also be indefensible and unjustifiable in many ways. But today, just overnight, just the course of this weekend, I genuinely, I'm not quite sure how we should handle this conversation today. 0345 60 60973. The question really is I don't know what the end looks like. I don't know what the end looks like. Nick had a caller towards the end there. I think it was Sam. I think he was called Sam. And he just suggested it can't end until Gaza ceases to exist in its current form. This sort of bizarre little ribbon of land and enclosed and fenced off really from the rest of the world. You know, it's a wall on one side and the sea on the other. How does it end unless that ceases to exist in its current form? There's a brief, and I don't have the history either. That's what I mean about my job being to sound like I know what I'm talking about. I don't have the history for this. I mean, I know about Yom Kippur, and I know about some of the history. I know about the foundation of Israel, and of course I know about the Holocaust, but I don't have the history. I don't know how close we ever were to a two-state solution, how much a difference assassinations would have made. You can't do counterfactuals. They're like sliding doors, aren't they? If that hadn't happened, if they'd recognised Hamas when they won an election in, was it 2006? Would the world be different? Because innocent people in Gaza are prisoners of Hamas as much as they are prisoners of geography. And on it goes, on it goes, on it goes. Indefensible and unjustifiable. But it never is it? Nothing ever is. You've got people defending Vladimir Putin against criticism for the continuing invasion of Ukraine. Nothing's ever indefensible. We never ever agree on indefensibility. Indefensible, unjustifiable, regardless. And I don't even know what word you use here. Do you use the word context? Is there context? See, they're right, there isn't context for massacre. Or is there? Well, what's the correct word to use? Talk about context? Talk about provocation? You even introduce the concept of provocation into a conversation like this, and you're knocking at the door of justification. The line between explanation and excuse is never thinner, is it, than when you're trying to have a conversation like this. And all through it, underneath it, all along, right alongside, is the knowledge that everything's going to get worse. You've got troops now. I think Israel has 4 options, essentially, one of which is already underway, that sort of epic aerial bombardment. Human shields in place. That's a large part of the rationale for taking hostages, so that you hold them in places that may come under attack in the hope of diluting or stopping those attacks. And, of course, there's 2 million people in the Gaza Strip, the massive majority of whom are innocent of any involvement in the attacks on Israelis over the course of the weekend, and yet who will be on the receiving end of an apocalyptic response. Indefensible. Ah, dear. 16 minutes after 10 is the time. I'll read you some of my texts today. I won't read you all of them. I'll put some of them straight in the bin. But I think do you know what I nearly did? Thanks for listening, by the way. It's always helpful to be able to get stuff off my chest. What I nearly did is invite you to tell everybody why we need to talk about this. Because there is a huge temptation not to. It's, I guess if you wanted a clumsy analogy, it's the difference between slowing down when you're driving past a road traffic accident and actually speeding up or looking the other way. I don't want to see the horrible stuff. I don't want to think about it. I don't want to contemplate it. But of course, and if one person slows down, then everybody slows down. Everybody slows down. 10:17 is the time. So I don't know how it ends. How does it unfold? I think I'll ask you that, because there'll be people listening who have a lot more invested in personally than I do. But how does it unfold now? Hit the numbers you will get through. And I don't know how much tolerance I will have for rejection of indefensibility today. Listen, I'm just a person. I'm not an AI creation or a robot or an emotionless automaton or a journalist required to walk all sorts of tightropes. I'm just me, and I don't think I've got the stomach for that today. I don't think I've got the stomach for you saying, "Yeah, look, I know a couple of 100 kids got killed while they were dancing in the desert," but I don't think I've got the stomach for that today. And next week, if we're talking about Palestinian children dying on the end of Israeli missiles, Israeli bullets, I'll probably feel the same. And that's not intellectually consistent. I say, well, it's very sad that all these Palestinian children have died, but. And I say, there can't be a but. There's no but on either one of these, but there it is. Doesn't make sense, does it? I find that heartbreaking and I find that heartbreaking. 19 after 10 is the time. Why do we have to talk about it? I'm not quite sure. But the most obvious answer is because it's there and it's happened. And it is, as we speak, still happening.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
22 minutes after 10 is the time. Those are the three words today. Inexcusable, indefensible, unjustifiable. And the sort of heartbreaking knowledge that lots of people don't think so. And then that side order of the cynicism required to look at the atrocities inflicted upon Israelis over the course of the weekend and use it as an opportunity to just go after your historic foes, your historic enemies. Going after people for failing to condemn it, if they are public figures, if they are politicians, failing to condemn it, I think is just about reasonable. But if it's your first thought, instead of horror and heartbreak, your first thought is, I bet so-and-so won't condemn it. And Jeremy Corbyn, obviously, is the most obvious person in this category. You can all be wrong. He can be wrong not to condemn it, and you're wrong for thinking here's and Dominic Lawson writes an article in the Daily Mail about Keir Starmer, trying to somehow tie him into Corbyn's querulousness. It's just pathetic. It's almost as if there is no atrocity huge enough for people to just temporarily bury their previously held grievances and animosities and focus instead upon the slaughter of the innocent. Les is on form. He's been in touch to say, what a pathetic human being you are. What a pathetic cretin you are. I beg your pardon. Sorry, Les. Good luck to your kids having a father like you. A perfectly normal response, Les, to the conversation that we're having this morning, as indeed is this one, which says, why do you never talk about the Palestinian children? You mean the children I was literally talking about 4 minutes ago? It's just bizarre. Makes you wonder whether we've evolved much at all in the last 2,000 years, doesn't it? I don't know that we have, to be honest with you. It's always there below the surface. But how does it unfold? Tamar is in Finchley. Tamar, what would you like to say?
Hi. Sorry, I'm going to be a bit emotional because it does come from a bit of a very personal place that I am in.
Don't apologise to me for being emotional on a day like today, Tamar, please. Okay,
I live in the UK for the last 24 years, and I'll start with saying that I don't agree with the Israel occupied territories. I do not agree definitely with the current government, and definitely I initially don't support Bibi and not his ministers. Yes. I'm really, I think most of the Israelis that I know don't agree and they don't support, and this is why there are already 40 weeks of protest in Israel.
Yeah.
When I was 7.5 years old, in 1978. I was in a terrorist attack in Israel. We were a few families who just came back from a day out, and 13 terrorists took us hostages in order to make a big attack in Tel Aviv. So we were on the bus for a few hours, and a lot of people died, and grenades flew around, and I've lost my father, my mom was injured. We all had a lot of trauma after it. Lucky I'm alive,
yes,
and I can tell the story. But it's I always said I don't want my kids to grow up and go through what I went through, and this is why I really decided when I want to have a family that I don't want to let my kids go for what I went through. So when I saw all the images and all the hostages this weekend, my brother already called me he's abroad as well, and he said, I can't stop crying. I've got flashback. I can't stop crying. And I'm not there, but I as I said, I don't support what the Israeli government is doing. But to see what went through there,
Yes.
it's heartbreaking. And then to hear the BBC one-sided, it's upsetting. It's so upsetting. I don't have the answer. How can you make it better? I don't. I wish. But to take one side, it's not fair. I know both sides are going to lose in this. Both sides are losing already so much.
Who wins?
No one wins. No one wins. No one is going to win. Everyone is losing. Everyone is lost a family. I know of our son of our friend who
Yes.
just died as a soldier. It's heartbreaking. And I know one who was actually in the party, who was running for 15 kilometers, and he's literally got a few gunshots at him, and he is lost. No one is going to win. There are people who are suffering there. There are people in Israel who are suffering. I don't think it's going to be any winner, definitely not in this situation. And it's just probably going to escalate, because in the north it's going to be the Hezbollah, who are going probably to start firing. And so no one, I don't think anyone is, it's not a winner. No one is winning here. There's only losers.
I don't know. You could tell, I think, before you came on the radio that I'm not quite sure how to conduct today's conversation, but I'm grateful to you for your courage in telling your story. Did you say your father was killed in the attack that you were?
Yes.
Was this the Coastal Road massacre?
Yes.
Oh,
35
Tamar.
people died.
I mean, you were almost... I mean, I know your brother used the term flashback, but that must have been... I mean, for you, more than almost anybody else alive, yesterday's events must just have been unbearable, unthinkable.
It's terrible. It's terrible to see what people are going through. The people are in the house. You see videos. I don't see what you see in the Israeli media is much more information of what's going on with the families who got hostages, or the family who just saw the sister died, or the kids who are. You see so much pain, and you see so much unnecessary pain, and and it's a pain and a bit of anger about the government.
Yes, and that I think you're right. The further you are away from Israel, the harder it will be to perhaps both follow and understand the complexity of the domestic political situation, because here it already gets cast as a sort of good versus evil, or you must pick a side. It's why I'm grateful to you for opening with a critique of Netanyahu's government, but then making clear the basic humanity of your response to the atrocities of the weekend. Can I ask you a question? And if you don't want to answer it, or if it's inappropriate, or the timing is wrong, then just tell me to shut up, Tamar, please.
No worries.
What is the current understanding of the intelligence failure in Israel? Because it took absolutely everybody by surprise, didn't it? Everybody.
Well, I'm not there, and I'm not.
No, of course.
But the rumors are that what I feel, that it's like they were already like few weeks ago and a month ago that some of the politicians said, we need to speak about what's going on with the army. We need to speak about what's going on the border.
Yes.
And Netanyahu literally shut everyone down. So, things will be fine. For him, it was more important, what I feel, to take and protect those settlers, to pray on whatever they shouldn't be praying, or having this party for, I understand it's a Jewish holiday.
Yes.
And so all of the soldiers were there because this is where Netanyahu and his government think that is where they should be, but they shouldn't be there.
Right.
They should protect the civilians who are not the settlers, but they were busy, and this is where Netanyahu, he was cutting off all of the information that actually people already said for a month or so. Something is going on the border. Something will happen. But Netanyahu is busy with, I don't think he's got, I think there's a lot of blood on his hand, but not a conscience.
Well, yes, again, I'm grateful to you for describing the complexity. How old were you in 1978? Do you mind me asking you?
I was 7.5 years old.
And when you discovered subsequently that the leader of the attack, or one of the key terrorist was an 18-year-old How have you processed that over the years, Tamar?
Well, she was the leader, the woman, and my mom, who is she's Dutch, my mom, and she spoke with them English. She tried to do the negotiation with them, to protect the kids, and we were hiding underneath the bus and the chairs, and we all were like in a panic. We all were. We didn't know what to do. No. And until today, my brother said I can't even. He was the worst with the post-traumatic, right. And he even diagnosed for in the future. Well, now
is he older than you?
He's 1 year older than me, right. And he's got a lot of health issues and mental health issues because of that. But
of course,
it's the two of the terrorists were captured alive, and they are still alive, and one of them is the police in the West Bank, as my mom knows, and the other one is as well. So they are highly ranked and highly appreciated there in the Palestinian authorities. Again, it's for me. I understand from where they are coming. They are frustrated.
Yes,
they are not in a good place. Then you go the government who's having all the settlers, and which I do not agree with, and it's a complicated situation. And I think what maybe could help is definitely changing the government and the way they are behaving.
And yet, even that 48 hours ago would have been a very different proposition from what it is now. I mean, the idea that any pursuit of peace has been set back years, if not decades, is very hard to resist, isn't it, really, today?
Yes, but
You don't stop.
Yeah. No.
Tamar, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Well, I'm sorry that you were in a position to make such a remarkable contribution to this conversation. I can't begin to imagine what you went through over this weekend. I really can't, or your brother. Take care, Tamar.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
10:37 is the time, and if you weren't reeling before Tamar rang into the programme, you will, of course, be doing so now. And it occurred to me, actually, just reflecting upon her remarkable story, it occurred to me that there are no analytical contributions of note to be made today. Or rather, there is no prospect whatsoever of anybody providing a definitive analysis, not just of what is going to happen next, but also of what has just happened. The best I've found is by a reader in Israeli studies at SOAS, part of the University of London, the School of Oriental and Asian Studies, called Yair Wallach, writing in The Guardian today. And I'll read you two whole paragraphs of it because I think it's really helpful. And, if we do anything together on this programme every morning, we try to understand stuff, even sometimes the apparently incomprehensible. But he writes in conclusion to an excellent article that I really recommend you read all of. He writes, some commentators believe the attack to be an Iranian coordinated attempt to foil the Saudi normalization with Israel. Such explanations are unconvincing. The willingness of Gulf states to normalize relations with Israel may have galvanized Hamas's willingness to act, but a major escalation in Palestine-Israel was already underway. With a dramatic rise in Palestinian casualties in the West Bank, the ethnic cleansing of several small communities, intensified settlers' attacks, and blatant changes to the status quo at the Al-Aqsa Mosque or Temple Mount in Jerusalem. Many, therefore, believed a popular uprising, another intifada, was only a matter of time. It may have been that Hamas decided that an escalation was coming and it wanted to keep the initiative in its own hands. This attack is the largest military blow Palestinians have ever dealt to Israel, as the Palestinian National Authority, which controls the West Bank, and its 87-year-old head Mahmoud Abbas fade into insignificance. Hamas aims to position itself as the real Palestinian leadership for the next stage, even if that means risking a confrontation whose outcome no one can predict. And that last line is chilling, isn't it, I think? Rahul is in Tower Hamlets. Rahul, what would you like to say?
I was just listening to you, James, talk about a solution. And I don't think there could, I don't know if I could come up with a solution or if anybody can come up with a right solution.
Well, I've got one very grim text that I will read you. where it says there are 3 ways to stop this. They learn to get along with each other, you build a better wall, or one side wipes out the other side.
This is the thing, isn't it? You've currently got a wall and you've caged people in, and this is why. It's people who feel so dispossessed, they don't feel like they can do anything. So instead of living in an open air prison, they're fighting back. And
because you're conflating civilians with terrorists, Rahul, which isn't really on, I'm afraid.
No, before I go into that, what I want to say, what I was calling about was that for a long time I believed in the 2-state solution. I thought it was the fairest way in which 2 groups of people could live together under one country where they coexisted. But a 2-state solution isn't something that's new. It's been bandied around for nearly 100 years. It's not the first time it's been proposed. But a 2-state solution is what it is at the moment.
But it surely it's slipped further out of reach this weekend.
Well, it has, yes. There's no equality. That's the thing with the 2-state solution. You have got 2 states, but there's no equality. You've got one group.
No, the 2-state solution isn't what's in place at the moment. That's a sort of that envisions an independent state of Palestine alongside the state of Israel west of the Jordan River. That's never happened.
No, it's not formally a 2-state solution, but it is acting in a way currently where you've got 2 different countries trying to, in a way, coexist, perhaps not successfully. One of the solutions that a lot of people have been talking about, and it's discussed by an Israeli historian by the name of Ilan Papp, is a 1-state solution rather than a 2-state solution, where both parties live together under one state, a secular state, where no one has an upper hand over the other side. And that, for me, sounds like a far better solution than having 2 independent states coexisting together. There will always be issues around equality. There will always be fight, and there will always be tension in the future between one side saying that the other side has a better deal. You can never have 2 states independently exist. You can have one state, and you can have people coexist under one state, and I think that might be the better solution. Obviously, like most people, I think it's easy to be reactionary. It's easy to look at the news and take one side or take the other side. And I was very much like yourself and most people. I wanted to know more about the history. I wanted to know why there was conflict between the 2 sides. And so I've been reading a lot and over the weekend just to try and give myself an understanding. And again, I mentioned this author, Ilan Papp. He's an Israeli historian.
Pappe.
He talks about the
I think it's Pappe, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think what people should do is read the conflict, understand from both sides exactly why there is a conflict, rather than going off by what the media is portraying it. Because all we do is, when we look at the news, is, we're all human. We see the loss and we see civilians attacked. We are going to feel a certain way. But if we take a step back and actually try and, obviously condemning the attacks, but also take a step back and understand, because this has been going on for so long. This isn't anything new, but there is no solution, and there's nothing that is going to be done. Only, as as your caller said before, it's just going to be, Israel will either it will be all Israel and Gaza ceases to exist, or we just continue as.
Go on.
No, that's all I was going to say.
Sorry, I lost you. I lost your words there. We can continue as what?
Just continue as we are at the moment. The status quo.
Well, I mean, the massing of ordnance and troops on the border is I mean, as I said earlier, there's 4 things. Whether or not they pile in with troops on the ground, it's certainly not certain. And you'd probably rather have a more stable leader in place in Israel. But thank you, Rahul. I understand what you're saying. You flirted with rejecting the notion of it being indefensible, but you didn't consummate the association. So I will thank you for doing that. And of course, the continuing conditions in Gaza can be cited as background, but never as justification, because the 3 words that run through our conversations today are inexcusable, indefensible, unjustifiable, and that's why it's such. What's the word I want? It's not unsatisfying. It's just there is no destination. It's a contemplation. There's no destination. You because apart from that grim text, which I don't think is false, by the way, 3 ways it ends: peace, a peaceful cohabitation, an impregnable wall, or one lot wipes out the other lot. But I don't really see any other conclusion, and that makes it a bleak conversation, doesn't it? Because the likelihood of peaceful cohabitation seems further away today than it has done in 50 years. I think so, anyway. And of course, it is the School of Oriental and African Studies, not Asian. As I said, that would be tautologist, I think. It's 10:45.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
10:49 is the time. I just heard the LBC 50-year anniversary promo. That's incredible. I can't believe you've been presenting that long, James. No, I haven't been here for the whole 50. I'd have been one when LBC started, although I suppose it's a nice moment to thank you for making this programme the most popular in that entire 50 years. And I think sort of perhaps calls like Tamar remind you why LBC holds a unique place in the media firmament in this country. 10 to 11 is the time. Let's go straight to Israel. Malcolm is calling from Tel Aviv. Malcolm, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. We've spoken before. As an expat and as a news gathering cameraman, I've never seen anything like I've seen the last few days. I was around to the IRA, to the London bombings, but this has gone beyond anything else. You're talking about what happens next. The problem is that Hamas knows that Israel won't go in too hard while there's hostages. There's only so much Israel can do. Yes, they can target the Hamas areas, but I don't think at the moment they really want to put ground troops in for the safety of the terrorists. And also at the moment, the fear here is if Israel goes in too hard, then Hezbollah is going to come down even harder than they did yesterday, which will then spark off Syria, and spark off the West Bank, and you're just going to have one bloodshed here.
So
it's going to escalate, James.
Well, yeah, but what does escalation look like? Because, and I know nobody knows. I mean, you know what it's like. We're asking questions about unknown unknowns, aren't we? Largely.
Absolutely. Look, I've got to tell you, as you were literally coming on the air when I was leaving a friend of mine's apartment building, and I'm north of Tel Aviv at the moment.
Yes. And
the sirens went off, so you then have to run into the shelter, and you're hearing the booms above you. And then you have to wait another 10 minutes because of the shrapnel. This is no way to live on either side. We feel for the Palestinians, but for some reason they've got this terrorist group that are hiding behind the civilians. But security-wise, how they breach the wall, we would love to have the answers. On the news, the local channels, all they've been saying is, give us answers. How could this happen? Okay, it was on the Sabbath. It was a Jewish holiday. But you don't let the security lax. But normally, if there's a holiday, they up the security.
Yes.
This is exactly what people just don't understand. And I don't know if you had it yesterday on Sky or whatever. They broadcast the families of some of these children that are now dead or missing through this rave. James, it's a rave.
Yeah.
This is unheard of. It's unprecedented. I'm never speechless. I don't know what to say. I have no idea what's going to happen next.
You've conveyed, oddly sometimes, not being able to articulate something speaks volumes, doesn't it? Because, as you say, you've covered stuff professionally. You've lived in Israel for some years. You've watched these events unfold with some of the background noise being real life rather than reportage, and you have a sense of almost mental disarray, I think, Malcolm, is how I'd describe it. Is that you don't know what. So we know, for example, that the Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant has ordered a complete siege on the Gaza Strip, which plays to your explanation of not wanting to endanger the hostages, the full number of whom is still not known for certain. So that means there's no electricity, no food, and no fuel making its way into an enclave that contains 2 million human beings. Right? What does
that's as far as I'm concerned, that's inhumane. You can't.
But there'll be a sense in government. We must do something.
No, I understand, but it's inhumane for the people, the everyday person living in Gaza, whether it's in Gaza or the West Bank or Tel Aviv or wherever. What upset me yesterday, I'm losing track of my days, yesterday.
Yeah, take your time.
When a hospital in Ashkelon got hit. Now, Ashkelon is south of Tel Aviv. What people don't realise is the majority of the doctors and nurses in all the hospitals here are Arab Israelis. They're killing their own. You can't say it's a religious thing. Opposite where I live, there's it's like a 7-Eleven type place. They call it AM/PM. It's a chain.
Right.
And not far from me is Tel Shemer Hospital, one of the big hospitals. And most of the youngsters working in AM/PM are Arab Israelis. Their English is impeccable. They have to. They're dealing with drugs. They're learning to be doctors and nurses. But these rockets, they're not sophisticated. They point and shoot and hope for the best on their behalf. And they're killing their own, and they can't see it. You go to Jaffa, which is very diverse. The Arab Israelis and the Israelis or whoever, they get on like brothers and sisters. They all go to the same restaurant. They don't want this.
There are counter narratives to what you're saying, but you're speaking from the heart, so I won't interrupt you more than I just did.
No. And what annoys me, obviously you've got the whole Jeremy Corbyn thing. Look, there are people that are going to be on the pro-Palestinian, and I understand it. Look, there's some things I don't agree with.
That's why I use those three words at the beginning: inexcusable, indefensible, unjustifiable. It's very, very hard on days like today to understand any perspective that rejects those three descriptions, that thinks there's a but that follows. Of course it's awful, but it's just awful, full stop. How does it...
I've meant to ask you the last time we spoke. Have you ever been here?
No, I haven't. My wife has. My wife loved it. I'd like to.
My son, one of my sons who lives in London, he's just got engaged to a British Cypriot girl.
Okay.
And they were over here a few weeks ago. Thank God it wasn't now.
Yeah.
She's never been here. It's Greek Orthodox.
Yeah.
Always wanted to come here. When she was here, she said, "It's not how I imagined." No. I said, "What, you imagine camels?" And she said, "I don't know what I imagined." She said, "But it's fantastic, the atmosphere." I said, "Yeah, because you have Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, and Israel. Same country, but they're worlds apart from each other." And now she's a nurse. She's a nurse in Enfield.
Gosh. And
she's been contacting me saying, "I just can't believe what's going on after what I experienced a few weeks ago."
I think you remind me actually of speaking to people in Kyiv at the outbreak of that invasion, where the shift, the violent shift from normality to epic abnormality happens in the blink of an eye, and I think it traumatises people not directly caught up in it, Malcolm. People like you, as you talk about explosions overhead and you contemplate the same footage, the same reports that we're watching from the other side of the world, that the knowledge that it is, you're in the thick of it, is I don't underestimate the toll it could take on you, or the impact it could take on you. Thank you for your call, and do take care, mate. Seriously. Numbers, I think, matter. More than 700 people killed in Israel since Hamas launched its attacks on Saturday morning, including, as Malcolm reminded us, some 260 dancing at a music festival. The Israeli government says about 100 Israelis have been kidnapped in these attacks, mostly taken into Gaza to be used, of course, as human shields. Now the death toll in the other direction stands at around 500 after Israel launched massive retaliatory airstrikes, about 500 people dead in Gaza. Air raid sirens sounding as we speak. In Jerusalem and across the country, across Israel, as the rockets that Malcolm just described are fired from Gaza. It's been likened by the Israeli military to the September 11th attacks on America in 2001, and you can see why. This is our 9/11, said one spokesman for the Israeli Defense Force. They got us. Another compared it to the 1941 Pearl Harbor attack. Israel says it's now regained control of its communities near Gaza, but says some militants remain active. And I mean, it's difficult to read. It's difficult to follow. But the reports of terrorists just marching around with guns, knocking on doors, waltzing into police stations and the like. I mean, it's too early now for that sort of conversation, but politically speaking, the question of how on earth this could occur in a country whose security is a source of constant scrutiny, constant conversation, and knowing where the threat comes from, and yet failing so completely to contain it in this case is actually breathtaking, but probably not something to which attention will turn immediately, although it's already bubbling away. The time is just approaching 11 o'clock.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 3 minutes after 11 and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where we continue to contemplate the horrors unfolding in the Middle East, in Israel this weekend. I mean, the scale and complexity of the surprise attack on Saturday will be something that is talked about for years to come, but attention will turn to it, I think, also in the next hours and days. That question of how it could have happened being one that will be more urgent in Israel itself than perhaps elsewhere in the world. I'll read you this from Peter. He says, I think from the comfort of our homes, it's very difficult to appreciate the daily horror those who live in the Gaza Strip go through. The embargo from Israel and Egypt makes life intolerable, along with the general repression of the populace by Israel when people are treated inhumanely, he writes. They behave in such a manner. This means every side involved in the conflict. International law needs to be enforced, not ignored. A reference perhaps to the failure of the Knesset to implement the international agreement for a two-state solution. A retired Rear Admiral called Philip Mathias has written a letter to a newspaper in which he points out that routine violations of human rights against the Palestinians, combined with the widespread poverty in the Gaza Strip, makes the region an easy recruiting ground for Hamas. Now, I think that just about fits within the parameters that I've laid down for our conversation today. Why would anybody join Hamas is a question that needs to be asked. Again, you have to walk the tightrope between explanation and excuse, but I think circumstances in Gaza will be part of the answer to that question. Although, of course, from the other side of the street, you will have people equally validly pointing out that an awful lot of what happens there is a consequence of the stranglehold in which Hamas holds the territory. 5 minutes after 11 is the time. And I stress again, and I don't do this often, but on this particular topic, wading in like you know what you're talking about with the sort of certainty that I bring to other conversations is absolutely not helpful or the order of the day. So I stress at every turn that I'm not approaching this from a position of deep and profound understanding, but in the very specific context of the terror attacks this weekend, I'm not really brooking any rejection of the descriptions inexcusable, indefensible, unjustifiable. 6 minutes after 11 is the time. Matt's in Guildford. Matt, what made you pick up the phone?
Morning, James.
Hello,
three
mate.
things. First of all, I lived in Israel for a number of years when I was a teenager.
Oh, yeah.
If I could express condolences, I think, and love to all the victims of this terror attack, both Israeli and Palestinian, and the ones to come, because it's going to be going on and on and on for a long time. And in my experience, it's the poor, dispossessed, and innocent ones that take the most brunt of these kinds of attacks and this kind of conflict. That's the first thing. I lived in the occupied territories when I was there. And in my opinion, and it's only my opinion, Israel is a secular, or a majority of people are secular. It's a fairly broad-minded, I'd even go as far as say is left-wing society. I mean, the kibbutz movement, which founded initially the society, was...
Is that why you were there?
Yes, I was on a kibbutz,
okay.
And it was effectively,
well, you say left. I think you mean liberal rather than left wing, probably.
Probably, yeah.
But
sorry.
you'd struggle to apply either of those descriptions to the current government.
Well, you absolutely would, and the current government's behaviour over a number of things has been inexcusable. So I'm not, no way would I ever try and defend the current Likud government of Israel. But the other thing that people haven't said when they've called in, and I just want to, and I don't want to be just parroting you, but unjustifiable, indefensible, inexcusable are exactly the words I would use. If I may, I would like to use another one, which is immoral. The reason there were many reasons why the attack by Hamas is immoral is not only attacking innocent people, but Hamas knew that the Israeli response would be catastrophic to the Palestinian people, and they did it anyway. And so I think that their behaviour has been completely immoral.
You know,
and sometimes
I find the conversation in general so tricky that I was quite tempted to have a bit of a philosophical debate about whether or not the word immoral is actually adding to the conversation, because it's a much more nuanced word. You could argue that the siege now being put in place by the Israeli Defense Force, which will see babies struggle to access energy, food, all sorts of resources. You could argue that that's immoral as well. You could argue, but whereas the reason I just stuck with those three words was because I don't think they brook as much nuance as words like immoral do. But I take your point. I take your point.
You have a fair point, and I'm not going to get into. I'm not stupid to get into a debate with you about that, James.
Not today. Any other day, I think I'd be up for it, but maybe not today.
No. And finally, and I hope this is going to sound quite depressing, and I'm willing to have be shouted down and put my head in the lion's mouth. But in my opinion, living there will never be peace in the Middle East whilst the parties of religion hold the balance of power. Yeah. And I'm afraid to say that is the parties of religion in Israel, in the small parties that hold power in the Knesset, the parties of religion in the Lebanon, the parties of religion all around that region, whilst they hold balance because their beliefs are absolute. And with absoluteness comes a lack of willingness to compromise. Yeah. And I think
it's not just a lack of willingness; is you don't need to even try. It's a sort of ethical impunity, isn't it? Because you believe that you're doing the will of God.
Well, exactly, and so and
that applies to Islamist terrorists as well.
Thanks for raising it. Well, exactly, and I was shot at when I was in Israel when I was on a bus. Yeah, I was going down from Jerusalem down to Eilat just for, I would say, a boys' holiday, but it's just like a few of us went down to Eilat for the beach. Yeah. And this lad shot us through the bus window. He was very quickly killed. I didn't know what was going on. I just thought it was just like firecrackers initially. What was scary was when I got out of the bus and he was shot by our the security guard on the bus, because he was age 9 in the first Intifada. Right, yeah. He was about 15. I was 18. And what, a 15-year-old suddenly decided to pick up a weapon, did he? Or was he groomed and persuaded by others to pick up a gun? And now that 15-year-old boy he was dead. And that's a life taken right in front of me. Anyway, thank you for taking my call, James.
Hey, Matt, thank you for calling. 10 minutes after 11 is the time. I said I'd read out a couple or a few of the slightly less hinged texts that inevitably come into the studio on a day like this. Here's one. It's unsigned, which I don't mean as a criticism particularly, just as a matter of fact. White people good, brown people bad. Just say it bluntly, James. You are racist. Which I mean, on a lighter note, it's a very refreshing change from the sort of text that I normally get on this program, which reference the ethnicity of people. 11 minutes after 11 is the time. Yusrol is in Barnet. Yusrol, what would you like to say?
Yeah, hi, good morning, James. My son has been in the Israeli army, is in the Israeli army, and he's been called up as part of the reserves yesterday morning.
Have you spoken to him?
I have actually spoken to him, yes. I called him late last night, and he's actually right on the Lebanese border with where the Sheba farms, right. where there's been some missile fired into Israel. But the interesting point he said to me was that his actual brigade was actually stationed in Gaza until yesterday, and his actual unit, which is Golani 13, has lost a lot of soldiers over the last couple of days. And when I asked him why isn't he going to Gaza, he said that his whole unit has been relocated to Lebanon because the Israelis are worried that if they do go into battle, that his unit will take what they called unfair revenge against any opponents they come across, and they will not act in accordance with the very high standards that Israel puts on its own soldiers. And it was an interesting point to me that even in this sort of situation where they've suffered so much casualties, they are still holding their own people to a moral level which they do not receive in reciprocation from the other side at all.
I mean, you're obviously right in terms of that context, but it's also, I mean, just acknowledging that it's a possibility, that it's a likelihood, is pretty grim as well, isn't it?
Oh, certainly. He said that. What
was his view on that? Did he think that it was likely that some of his comrades, or possibly himself, may? And we're talking essentially about breaching the Geneva Convention, which is the difference between a soldier and a terrorist in one sense, I suppose. So it's a helpful illustration. But was your boy offended by the imputation?
No, he actually wasn't. He just said that they are very realistic, and the feeling amongst his unit because of what they've suffered is very strong feelings, which he says is completely understandable. But it's a little bit frightening for his own safety and for what will happen over the next coming days.
How do you deal with it?
I just think of him in a nice, pleasant setting, sitting at home in London, having a coffee when I think of him there. Yeah, and that makes it manageable. I don't think of anything else.
You can't, can you? Really?
He always wanted to go to the army. He always, from a young child, when he was here, he always wanted to go, and he went when he was very young, and he joined it, and he joined an elite brigade, and it gave him a lot of discipline and a lot of structure, which was very useful for him.
There's 300,000 reservists called up. What do you think? You may not know, and you're not going to have any greater insights than anybody else. But what do you think is going to happen next?
There's going to have to be some sort of ground incursion there.
Do you think so? Going into Gaza?
I can't see any other option. They're not going to bomb the place to the ground. They just won't do that, and they have to restore some sort of security. But there is one other point which you just mentioned earlier, if I may raise. Of course. In terms of it being an open prison, you mentioned that it's got two borders. The fence on one side,
and Egypt on the other. I'm sorry, you're right. Yeah, I should have made that clearer.
And Egypt doesn't allow any sort of transport in and out of Gaza whatsoever. No. They do not want anybody coming from there. And Israel, from
why is that? What is the sort of historical rationale for that position?
Well, it's interesting because Israel gave back the whole Sinai in the 1979 peace agreement with Egypt, and they should have actually returned Gaza, which was captured from Egypt in the Six-Day War. But the Egyptians actually said, we don't want them because of the trouble that they cause. You keep Gaza. We'll take everything else. We'll take the whole Sinai, which is bigger than Israel, with the oil wells and everything else. But the Palestinians in Gaza, you keep that. That should be your problem. And they're even more intolerant. They don't provide them with any electricity. They don't provide them with any jobs, water, anything like that at all. And Israel does, which is another conundrum which is hard to understand.
That's very diplomatically put. And I thank you for putting it so diplomatically as well, because it is yet another element of the bigger picture that doesn't receive the scrutiny that it should. And of course, the sort of scrutiny that is applied to any of these issues is defined on days like today by the events of the last 48 hours. And it is, of course, because Israel plays a role in the provision of basic resources, that it is also in a position to withdraw them. We have the Times of Israel reporting this morning that Israel's defense minister has said, I have ordered a complete siege on the Gaza Strip. There will be no electricity, no food, no fuel. Everything is closed. Some of my less hinged texts telling me that he also went on to describe everybody in Gaza as being animals, but he didn't. He described Hamas. fighters or terrorists as human animals. He said, we are fighting human animals and we are acting accordingly. But of course, cutting off food, fuel and electricity to 2 million people will include lots of people, millions of people, in fact, who are not part of Hamas. But there it is. 11:17 is the time.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 20 minutes after 11. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where we continue to discuss the events in Israel and subsequently in Gaza over the weekend. So some of the photographs are just, hideous. And I'm afraid if you've got a problem with the use of language by the Israeli Defense Minister, as 2 or 3 of my texters apparently do, in the same breath that you're looking at photographs of women, kidnapped women being driven away on the back of motorbikes pleading for their life, or an injured female Israeli soldier being abducted in the back of a truck, then you possibly have your priorities a little distorted. Although you can't have a conversation about the Middle East or about Israel-Palestine problems, tensions, war, I think is probably the correct word to use now. It is a war, which means that some semantic conversations will follow, although I don't think we'll have them together on this programme today. You have to also look at the bigger historical picture. And just as a very thin ray of unintentional light being brought into the programme via my incredibly fertile inbox, I've just received one saying Israel is a murdering rouge state, which is, a infelicitous typo, I presume. 21 minutes after 11 is the time. Abdullah is in Leicester. Abdullah, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Yeah, look, the thing is, first of all, do we want peace? That's what we have to ask the question. And how do we reach that from where we are today? How do we attain peace for all concerned in the Middle East? I think the first thing we have to do is, instead of the UK and the US showing their complete solidarity, in fact giving carte blanche to Israel to say, do what you want, we're with you, regardless. In fact, we're going to send more ships. Instead of doing that and escalating the situation far further and enraging the Muslim world completely, instead of doing that, the first thing that should be tried to be achieved is a ceasefire, whatever that takes, whatever that entails. We need to try and reach some ceasefire so that in the interim, some sort of negotiation can be started. If we're just going to keep on escalating the situation further, there's going to be further bloodshed, further loss of life, further infuriating. In fact, it will create far more extremists than ever before. Then the world will be a far more difficult place for everybody to live in, wherever you live. Because we cannot accept.
Hamas have it in their charter that they want to drive Israel into the sea, don't they? So talk me through how that is a starting position in negotiations.
Well, when you say that's in their charter, but look, if Hamas
because it is, mate. So talk me through how that is the opening gambit in any peace negotiations.
No, obviously, look, they may have written that. I mean, look at it this way, James. I come to your house, or you invite me.
It's not they may have. They did.
Can I simplify it for you?
No, you have to answer my question just simply as you want, mate, of how that is an opening gambit in the peace negotiations.
No, obviously that has to be taken out in the sense that
before or after the ceasefire that you're calling for.
No, intention. Look, what I'm saying to you is that first of all, we have to sit with Hamas and say, look, is this really what you want? Is this your intention?
They wrote it down in their charter, Abdullah.
But there's so many things written by Israel. There's written by so many people, but they don't.
Now you're doing whataboutery.
Look, international law has to apply to Israel as well. You have to understand, Israel has been demolishing and completely disregarding.
That would be chapter 2 of any peace negotiations. But chapter 1 is, for the purposes of this conversation, how does an expressed desire to drive Israel into the sea set the groundwork and the foundations for fruitful peace negotiations?
I really don't think that's what the intention is. I'm sure they don't want to demolish the whole of Israel.
Okay.
Right, James.
So why do they have a charter then?
Yeah, that's probably been there for time. They probably haven't even bothered changing it. But my point is, look.
Why do they have it?
They've been negotiation. The Oslo Agreement was there, first of all, remember. Right? The thing is, look, we have to, even in the Oslo Agreement...
I appreciate you weren't expecting the conversation to go in this way, but you can't continue to endorse the notion of peace negotiations with the information that everybody has just heard me share with you.
No, but what I'm saying, James, that even if Hamas say, for example, that look, all we want to do is get our borders clear.
But they don't say that, do they?
No, they do. But
they say we want to drive Israel into the sea. And would it be with Hamas that you envision Israel negotiating?
They have to understand the plight of the Palestinians for 70 odd years. You can't just say, because one sentence.
John, you're jumping around a lot, aren't you?
So no, but you cannot.
Because we've talked a lot about the experiences of Palestinian people. We've talked a lot about Gaza being described, I think, by one of the former heads of the United Nations as the largest open prison in the world. No one's disputing the barbarism, really, of cutting off electricity, fuel and food to 2 million people as a punishment, in a sense, for the sins of a relatively small number. But I think the point you miss, and I'm grateful to you for trying to simplify things for the rest of us, I think the point you miss is Hamas don't want peace.
Of course they do. They want.
Which brings us to the bit in the Charter that you just think they don't really mean. And that's the point at which this conversation becomes a bit pointless.
No, James, the thing is, look, that's one sentence. Action speaks louder than words.
It's quite a big sentence, mate. Actions do speak louder than words, and we're talking about the actions of the last 48 hours.
If I come to you over the
from an organisation that you're now on the radio claiming wants peace,
James, if I come to you continuously, harass you, shoot your 2-year-old child, take away 90% of your house, and dictate to you how you can live your life in every aspect of your life, and you lash out and you throw a punch. Right? Do you expect me to sit there and take it all continuously?
So you're comparing the murder of 700 people to a punch.
No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that
totally are. Everyone just heard you.
I'm giving you. Come on, James. I'm not that daft, right? Every single life is
literally
sacred.
Literally just said it.
Every single life is sacred. I'm saying that you got to expect some reaction if you're going to keep on harassing people continuously on a daily basis.
So what you're doing is the thing that we said at 10 o'clock this morning that we weren't really going to allow today. Is you're arguing that it's not inexcusable, it's not indefensible, and it's not unjustifiable. You're offering up excuses, defences, and justifications.
I'm not justifying any loss of life. Every single life.
You are, because you just compared it to throwing a punch.
What I'm saying to you that there will be people who will not sit there and take it continuously. Yes. I mean, if you're going to keep on, there's been so many incidences, uncountable amount of incidents on a daily basis where the Palestinians are being harassed and oppressed. Right, this oppression has to stop. The 28 UN resolutions have been broken by the Israelis. Nobody says anything about that.
They're often talked about, but just not in the 48 hours immediately after a terrorist massacre, because that sounds like excusing, and that's what you sound like now.
That is not an excuse.
Well, I'm glad that it's not your intention, but it's a very odd points to make in the context of the murders that we're discussing.
What I'm saying, after this, we want peace. So how do we attain that peace? My point is, how do we attain peace?
Well, my point is, you don't attain peace by negotiating with an enemy that wants to drive you into the sea. I don't know quite. I mean, listen, I'm not rude. Crikey, there goes the truth alarm. No, I'm really not rude. But so the point at which I point out to you what it says in the Charter is really the point at which this conversation on an intellectual basis ended, isn't it? Because you're now reduced to claiming that you know that Hamas don't really mean it. Which is we'll both agree ridiculous.
What they've written in the Charter, I mean, Hamas has written, that is what they've written. There's so many things that UK
You're doing it again. I mean, and it's not your fault. You didn't write it, but it's the point at which this conversation becomes pointless, because you're now telling me that what Hamas have written in their Charter, their very raison d'etre, the essence of their existence, you're here to tell me from Leicester that they don't really mean it.
Ismail Haniyeh, the Hamas leader, what did he say?
Just absorb the words I've just said.
Have you listened to Hamas? That's the point, James. Have you listened to what they're saying, what they want?
Well, how can I know? I presume they don't mean that either.
They have said that.
So you're choosing the bits that they mean and the bits that they don't mean. From what position of authority do you do that, Abdullah?
Listen, James. My point is, you have to listen to what they are saying. Don't just listen to a piece. Don't just read a piece of paper and then. You have to listen to what they're saying. Listen to his interviews, what he said, what they want.
I shall.
They want. Yeah,
and I shall look forward to him being asked about the expressed desire to drive Israel into the sea. And if he says, "Oh, we don't really mean it," then I guess you'd have a point.
you have to listen to what he says. Don't just read what. Don't just pick up Google
don't just read what they say. You have to listen to it as well. Okay, I shall do my best.
You have to listen to what
I shall do my best to broaden the horizon by both listening as well as reading what is said in the context of it. I will. Thank you, Abdullah. It's coming up to 11:30. Peace negotiations are arguably the only way out of this, but the question then becomes who you negotiate with. And the idea that the people responsible for the events that we saw this weekend are minded to sit around a table and have a peaceful chat seems to me to be highly unlikely, not least because of the contents of the Charter. But, it would be nice to believe that there were an alternative route out of this horror show. Abdullah, take care.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 11:33. Labour conference underway, of course, being somewhat overshadowed both internationally and I think nationally at the moment by the unfolding situation in Israel Palestine, where the reason I mentioned semantics earlier is because if it is a war, then there comes a point where you struggle philosophically and ethically to call one side soldiers and one side terrorists. But as it stands at the moment, the atrocities inflicted by Hamas on Israeli civilians over the weekend were clearly and definitively acts of terrorism. But it does become philosophically nuanced when the collective punishment, I think, is still a war crime under the Geneva Convention. But I guess the definition of punishment then becomes somewhat negotiable, and besieging the whole of Gaza, which is how the Israeli Defense Minister has described it, cutting off energy, food and other supplies, electricity, is what's that? Well, actually, we could do that. My phones are all full at the moment, but just in the interests of understanding, what does that achieve? What does that achieve? What does cutting off all? What's the end game? What's the hope that they will just hand over the Hamas terrorists, or that the Hamas terrorists will just put their guns down and walk into Israeli arms? I genuinely don't know. That's a genuine question, actually. I've seen the coverage of the story, widespread coverage of the description, but I don't understand what the justification would be, what the intention would be. And I'm possibly being really stupid, and I'll take one phone call and it'll last 2 minutes, and you'll tell me what the thinking is on the siege now of the whole of Gaza, and I'll feel very stupid for asking the question in the first place. But the other element of that is that if Israel blockades Gaza, that's a better word perhaps than siege, then I don't know historically, and I've made no bones about my lack of deep understanding that's something that Egypt could easily undermine, isn't it? Both geographically and presumably logistically. But this complete siege, that's the word that Israel's defense minister has deployed, saying authorities will cut electricity and block the entry of food and fuel. What does that achieve? 11:36 is the time. Milad is in Chiswick. Milad, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. First time caller.
Blimey, you pick your moment.
I know, right? I mean, and I just really I love listening to contributions of others.
Same.
Just here, so I'm just here in the capacity of someone who's kind of studied the region and studied Israel and Palestine for the better part of a decade. And I just think a lot of your callers are coming in with, I guess, the stereotypical response, which is like angry triggered Muslim or angry triggered Jewish person who rings up a talk show and doesn't know quite exactly how to get their emotions across. So
try not to patronise them, Milad.
I'm not trying to patronise. I think the last 48 hours have been terrible. I think you can say that the acts of Hamas are deplorable, and then you can also say that the acts of Netanyahu over the last year or so is equally just as deplorable, because
but a lot of the callers that you've just insulted have said that.
But what's happening is, I think a lot of people
will say that, and then they'll go back to, the conversation about international law over the last 30 years, or they'll talk about something to do with international law ideology, and then they'll take it to somewhere where you, as the kind of mediator, will question, there seems to be a lot of aggression coming towards your point, and so this doesn't get the Israelis and the Palestinians any closer. So the only point, if there's one point I'm trying to make, it is that when you're talking about the Charter of Violence or the Charter, Hamas's Charter, Hamas are not the representatives of the Palestinian people. They were democratically elected at some point within this modern history of the Palestinian people. But what's happened is the Palestinian people, every single time they had a representative who was attempting to do anything, get any further, be it within any of the accords, the international community did not put enough pressure on the Israelis over the last 5 decades. So the question now is, what is Hamas? Hamas is no more than a proxy. It's no more than a proxy. It's no more than an outpost, right, for Iran, for Hezbollah, for a group of countries who have put themselves geopolitically in staunch opposition to not only the Israeli state, but what is in more modern times referred to as the Arab Zionist groups of Saudi Arabia, the UAE and Gulf. So I think it's really important and maybe quite sobering to the people who are hearing this, including maybe the people that I might have patronized who are very devout Muslims, sitting, listening, thinking.
I just listen. I'm going to patronize you a bit now.
Tell me, go for it.
Just try and make a cogent point in a couple of sentences if you can, because all I've heard so far is a sort of word soup.
Okay, so what's going on right now is we're going to have, and it's falling apart in the Western world. The relationship between Muslims and Jews it gets worse and worse every time something like this happens. I want for people to understand, right, that Muslims and Jews are firstly brethren tribes. Secondly, in the world of geopolitics,
I don't know if we are pinning this down into easily comprehensible sentences.
It has to be.
Because I've got a guest waiting on the other line. So
I understand.
Can you say? When you thought, what is the central point that you wanted to make, if you can?
The central point I want to make is that people like Netanyahu, Trump, Mohammed bin Salman, leaders, right, in the modern world, have been willing for this day to come. Because every time they miss an opportunity to create peace, they're only going to lead to the eventuality of war.
I think that's a really good point. I think that's a really
point I wanted to make.
And I'm glad you did. I think that I don't want to call it lazy, but I'd call it a naive presumption that all leaders actually want peace. Whether you're talking about the leaders of Hamas or the so-called leaders of the free world is a little bit, let's just say, overly optimistic. Thank you, Milad. 20 to 12 is the time. Sadiq Khan, the Mayor of London, is at the Labour Party conference in Liverpool and joins us now. Before we talk about the conference, we will inevitably talk about events in Israel over the course of the weekend, and also the rather unsightly, unseemly, unacceptable sights of people celebrating these terror attacks on the streets of London. Sadiq Khan.
Yeah, good morning, James. So I spent this morning at a synagogue in Liverpool, the Prince's Road Synagogue, where you've got some pretty scared, frightened Jewish people. Many Jewish Londoners were with me at the synagogue, and I spent a lot of time this morning in contact with our police service in London. Firstly, I just want to, first chance I've had to speak to you since the events over the weekend, to condemn the actions of Hamas in Israel, but also to explain to those of your listeners that aren't Jewish the trauma and fear felt by Jewish people in London and indeed across the country. And the ripples of fear are felt because they know that when there are disturbances in the Middle East, it often leads to an increase in hate crime, anti-Semitic crime in London and across our country. And the reason why last night's windows being smashed in this restaurant I've been to many times, Pizza Restaurant,
in Golders Green,
and in Golders Green, and the graffiti is so serious, is because the Jewish community have in their memory the events of the 1930s, with Jewish properties having their windows smashed, a community that was a minority feeling as if others are against them, incitement towards hatred. And that's why it's incredibly important for me to say to your Jewish listeners, the police over the last 48 hours, that there's been an increased presence in our communities to make sure Jewish Londoners feel safe. as it is. If your place of worship is a synagogue or your school of choice is a Jewish faith school, there's increased, enhanced security. It's upsetting for me to say that. That's the reality of being a Jewish person. That's been enhanced over the last couple of days. But I want to be quite unequivocal about this. There is no place for hatred, anti-Semitism, incitement in London. The full force of the police will come down on you if you try and do those things.
And yet, of course, there will also be, and in a way I'm sort of ambushing you with a conversation that's already an hour and a half old, but there will also be a lot of trauma and fear among the 2 million people who've just discovered that they're having their electricity, food and fuel cut off.
Well, let me just say,
Gaza.
And it's really important I make this point. Look, it's possible to be pro-Palestinian and pro-Palestine and condemn Hamas, condemn what Hamas have done in Israel. There's something inconsistent with being critical of Prime Minister Netanyahu and saying that what Hamas done is unacceptable, and also to show solidarity with our neighbours in London and by the way in Manchester and Liverpool and other parts of the country, the globe, where we know Jewish people are going to face anti-Semitism. And I think actually, you know, it's the oldest form of hatred known to man, some would say, anti-Semitism. And, you know, a source of pride to me that I was invited in advance of this weekend, weeks ago, to go to an event at synagogue here in Liverpool. And those of us who aren't Jewish have got to understand why our Jewish neighbours, friends, colleagues are feeling scared.
Why did Susan Hall say that Jews were scared of you?
Oh, look, it's for her to explain why she said what she did. But my concern about what she said and the way she said it is we're seeing a repeat of 2016 in relation to the tactics used by the Conservative Party, who are the only party, by the way, who can win the mayoralty, except for me. It's a two-horse race, particularly with the government changing the voting system to first past the post and photo ID. And what I'd say to her, the Conservative Party, in a polite, courteous way, is for goodness sake, don't weaponise the Jewish community to win votes. Stop it.
Were you surprised to hear Rishi Sunak give her a vote of confidence just a few days after she'd accused you of frightening Jewish people in North London?
Well, we saw last week not just the Prime Minister, the Home Secretary, proudly supporting the Conservative candidate, as they did in 2016. But, you know, listen, if it's going to be a repeat of that campaign, I'm hoping it's a repeat of the ending of that campaign, which is us in London showing that, you know, hope overcomes fear and unity overcomes division. I
don't know how many conferences you've attended as a Labour politician, but as you look back over all of them, where does this one rank in importance?
So I'm showing my age now to those of you listeners who think I'm 25. My first one was 1994.
Crikey.
And this is pretty special because obviously for a long time we've been in opposition. There's no complacency in this conference at all. The metaphor I used when I've done a number of events, you'd imagine, the metaphor I've used is, you know, look, we're top of the table, but the season has a long way to go. And you speak to any good football captain or football manager, the most important game is the next game. Our next game is Rachel Reeves' speech in a little while, Keir Starmer's speech tomorrow, and we've got a number of games before the general election. What Keir, Rachel and the team have done is show the difference between a Labour Party and a Conservative Party. Just in the last couple of days in Liverpool versus Manchester, we're united. We are telling truths. We're setting out a positive vision compared to a Conservative Party last week, divided, telling lies and running away from their record.
You've seen the word clouds surrounding Keir Starmer, which focus really upon the absence of much substance. Do you expect that to be fixed by the end of the week, by the end of conference?
Well, look, I think what we're going to do is understand the trajectory in relation to when the election is going to be and the cycle. So the 2/3 of the mission is done, changing our party for the better. And I make this point, had this conference taken place a few years ago, in the aftermath of what Hamas did in Israel, it'd be a very different Labour Party conference taking place. So he's changed our party for the better. Secondly, he's been an effective opposition to the government, calling out where the government's got it wrong. I think he's on his third Prime Minister. The third part of the mission is setting out our positive mission for the country. And you've seen in the last couple of days from West Street and setting out how we're going to deal with the backlog in the NHS. Angela Rayner setting out how we're going to build more genuinely affordable homes, make developers do more towards fixing some of the challenges we have. Rachel Reeves setting out how we're going to make sure we make planning easier for those parts of development support businesses. to the investment in the green economy. And Keir tomorrow will be setting out why he thinks he's the best person to be Prime Minister, and I'm incredibly excited.
Well, we look forward to that speech. Just a quick eye cast back at last week's conference. Mayor of London, HS2. How do you respond to the decision to call off the link between Birmingham and Manchester?
Look, when I was given some of the challenges in 2018 about the Elizabeth Line Crossrail, one of the options I had was to throw the towel in, to say it's too difficult to finish Crossrail, it's too difficult to get a grip on the costs. I chose not to do so. I sent my people into Crossrail Limited Company. They told me it wasn't fit for purpose. I persuaded the government to let me take over Crossrail. We completed it. The Elizabeth Line is now the most popular train line in the country, used by more than 230 million people so far, 4.2 million journeys a week. If you build it, they will come. I think the government's made a bad mistake throwing the towel in. They've made a bad mistake with this confusion caused by them throwing the towel in. Why would you, as a business person, as an investor, invest in the UK when the government chops and changes policies like High Speed 2? My real problem with High Speed 2 for London is we've now got a High Speed 2 line going from Birmingham and Curzon Street to Old Oak Common. Only the Conservatives could build a high speed line slower than a Victorian line from Birmingham New Street to Euston.
What would you do if you were leader of the opposition with regard to the choice between ruling out reopening it or putting in a position that makes it harder to sell off some of the infrastructure, to sell off some of the land, to essentially send a message to business and voter alike that it could well be resurrected under a Labour government? Because so far Keir Starmer has not done that, has he? Well,
look, I've spent some time with Keir over the last few days, as you'd imagine. Look, one of the reasons why Keir and Rachel can't write a blank cheque.
That's not quite the question I'm asking. It's more of a formal holding position as opposed to a formal rejection.
Sure. Well, one thing they can't write the blank cheque for High Speed 2 for obvious reasons. We don't know how bad it's going to be in 18 months' time. But what we can do is safeguard the route.
Yes.
And so what we did with the Elizabeth line, but also with the Bakerloo line and with Crossrail 2, we're trying to do is safeguard the route, because the problem we've got with the government's messages last week is they may sell off some of the land we need to build High Speed 2 if later on we can afford it. So what I'd want the government to do is to mothball the route. Okay. So if at a future date we can have the funds to build it, we can do so. But also in the meantime work with the private sector, with businesses to fund it. I'll tell you another story that people don't realise about the Elizabeth line. One third of it is paid for by businesses, and I want to thank them for investing in this piece of really important infrastructure. Why isn't the government talking to businesses to support them with High Speed 2?
Sadiq Khan, many thanks. Live from Labour conference in Liverpool, where, as he reminds us, Rachel Reeve due to speak today and Keir Starmer due to speak tomorrow. A helpful line, actually, because I said from the start that I find this particular conversation almost unbearably difficult, and that helpful line, which perhaps has been a little bit missing from the some of the discourse so far, although not by any stretch of the imagination entirely absent. So it's perfectly possible to condemn in the strongest of terms the atrocities undertaken by Hamas this weekend, while still expressing solidarity with, sympathy for, and indeed support for Palestinian people. We'll find out next from another guest what might be on the cards militarily in the coming days, weeks, and of course even longer. The time now is 11:51.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
11:54 is the time, and you're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, running a little late on that junction because of the conversation with the Mayor of London. Dr. Tobias Bork is a Senior Research Fellow in Middle Eastern Security Studies at the Royal United Services Institute and joins me now. Apologies in advance for such a silly question in a way, Tobias, but I'm going to ask it anyway. What do you think is likely to transpire next in this escalating conflict?
Yeah, thanks for having me. I think it is a very difficult thing to predict at this point, of course. I think we sort of have two paths in front of us. One is that this remains contained to Gaza and southern Israel. I think it's almost certain that Israel's military response will be extremely hard, aggressive, and extensive within Gaza. And we're seeing the beginning of that already. Now, the question, so the first option is that this remains a conflict that is in Gaza, around Gaza, and that is it. The other option is that we do see groups like Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, or some of the militant factions in the West Bank, or others around the region looking to intervene in this, and that then turns into a sort of spiral of escalation that spreads wider. And for Israel itself becomes a two-front conflict, one in Gaza, one on its northern border. But I think those are currently the two options that we have in front of us.
I mean, logistically, presumably the Israeli forces are far superior.
Absolutely. I mean, look, Israel has by far the most well-equipped, best trained, strongest military in the Middle East region. So there's no doubt about who has the military, superiority here.
Do you think that they will send troops into Gaza?
I think that is probably the question that Israeli military leaders, but especially political leaders, are weighing right now. Prime Minister Netanyahu has made it pretty clear that he does not see this as yet another round of conflict around Gaza, or I think he put it, not another round of fighting. This is a war. So then the question becomes, what makes it different, right? And I think for a ground invasion, which I think is definitely a distinct possibility, the big question there is the question of the hostages, of course. On the one hand, you would assume that Hamas has taken hostages in order to achieve some kind of objective, in order to perhaps have some form of deterrent effect. But I think that this attack has been so of such a scale that any form of deterrence is kind of out of the window. And I sort of expect a very, very strong Israeli response, and I would not be surprised if that includes a significant deployment of ground forces into Gaza.
I see. And finally, Tobias, could you give us an indication of the scale of surprise at the scale of the attack, and indeed, for want of a better word, the success of it?
Well, you hear Israeli leaders right now, right? They're talking about that this is Israel's 9/11. This is Israel's 9/11 and Pearl Harbor wrapped into one. Looking for superlatives to express just how big this is, and I think that answers your question in a way, right?
Well, it answers half of it, because September the 11th kind of was freakish in both conception and execution, and yet Israel knows where the threat lies. It knows specifically to sort of points on a map where the threat is going to come from, and yet somehow all defences were breached on a spectacular scale.
Well, but I think just because it was so spectacular, we have just never seen anything like this, right? This was not a few rockets or even a few hundred rockets. This was a couple of thousand rockets and a sort of very concerted, essentially invasion. No one had expected this. I had conversations last week with other people sort of looking at regional security and thinking about the different issues that we see coming up over the next few years. And this was precisely no one had this on their sort of radar. So I think it's an enormous surprise. You're right, Gaza is the source of threat. Hamas is the source of threat for Israel, but also one that I think Israel felt like it was able to manage. This weekend, that assumption was completely turned on its head.
And what does that do to Netanyahu's position?
Well, I think that's a big question, right? In the past, Israeli prime ministers have not been able to survive these kinds of security and military failures, right? Golda Meir, Menachem Begin, both of those wear out after significant military and security failures. So, Netanyahu, who has made security his thing, has some serious questions to answer. I don't think they're necessarily questions that are going to be answered in the next couple of days.
Sure.
I think that is for once the main part of this conflict, of this war, is over. But yeah, he will have to confront very significant questions, no doubt.
Dr. Tobias Bork, Senior Research Fellow in Middle Eastern Security Studies at RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute. Thank you very much for your time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I've made an executive decision to do something completely different for the final hour of the programme. I'm going to give you a quick heads up. To celebrate 50 years of LBC, 20 of which I've actually been here, which makes me feel like part of the furniture, makes me feel like an old chair. I think we could do an hour of your most memorable moments as a listener. I think that might be quite appropriate, actually, and hopefully quite uplifting. It's 12 noon.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
4 minutes after 12 is the time. Now, I have to warn you in advance that you need a slightly overdeveloped ego to do this job. There are one or two presenters who have somehow managed to get behind a microphone on LBC over the last 50 years who have never struck me as being possessed of overdeveloped ego. There may even be one or two on the schedule currently, but I'm not so sure about that, actually. So you do need a slightly overdeveloped ego to do this job, which is fine. And, self-knowledge is a wonderful thing. So I am prepared for other people's programmes to feature more heavily than mine in the hour that follows. Not least because for 30 years of LBC's history, I wasn't even here. I think my first introduction to this station was probably Brian Hayes, who was in this slot and who could quite easily start an argument in an empty room. A supreme broadcaster, one of the absolute best, and an absolute stalwart of LBC. Also, for those of us that grew up outside London, watching blockbusters and not knowing that Bob Holness was keeping people company in London on LBC, in the company of the great Douglas Cameron, all sorts of things. But what I thought we'd do today, and I'm going to get loads of text coming in as well, but I'd like you just to share with me and everybody else your most memorable LBC moment. It can be deadly serious, because there have been some astonishingly serious moments. In fact, I think quite possibly Tamar's call from really early doors today will be one of the ones that stays with me for a very, very long time. And it could also be ridiculously silly. See, the problem now is if I give you some of my favourites, then it kind of robs you of the opportunity to ring in and share them. But there is one. When Nigel Farage presented on this station, what was particularly lovely about this was the visual clip, because you could see him visibly preening in the most sort of pathetic way. It was almost twirling his moustaches, if he'd had any moustaches, because someone rang in to say that they had voted to remain in the European Union, but they changed their minds. And Farage sort of simpers a bit and goes, "Oh, and what prompted you to change your mind?" And he's obviously expecting the caller to say, "Well, I've got to admit it was listening to you." And the caller says, "As cool as you like," without even breaking a beat for a moment, just says, "I got kicked in the head by a horse." And it was, I listen, simultaneously, for a presenter, it was quite chilling, because it can happen to any of us. But also, as a patriot, as someone who loves this country and has a deep and abiding problem with the people that have inflicted so much unnecessary damage on it, it was lovely to see one of the worst arsonists and saboteurs get rinsed so effectively in public. So that was... is it, 2 or 3? You're all saying that one. You're all going for that one already before I'd even shared it with you as one of my favourite moments. 7 minutes after 12. In terms of more serious moments, I had the privilege of meeting a lady called Lily Pohlman, who was a Holocaust survivor and who rang into the programme. She didn't just ring me, I have to stress. She was a bit of a regular, in fact, on LBC, but she was a storyteller of such astonishing warmth and insight that she relayed her life story and elements of it on the radio so powerfully. I then had the privilege of getting to know her off air, and she joined me on stage for a Make Some Noise fundraising event at the Leicester Square Theatre, and became a friend of mine. We lost her during lockdown. I was able to attend her funeral, and that was a very special moment for me. To perhaps echo some of the conversations we've been having earlier in the programme, and I stress that I do want this to be an essentially uplifting hour, but just let me give a nod to the morning of July the 7th when we were on air, and someone sent me a photograph of a motorway gantry that said, "London is closed, turn on your radio." I pray that I never have a moment like that again in my broadcasting career, and I was still very, very wet behind the ears back then, but that gives you an indication of the role that radio in particular or radio in general and LBC in particular can play in the lives of people listening. So 8 minutes after 12 is the time. Look back over your listening years. in some ways, the bigger prizes will be reserved for the oldest memory. If you could remember something from 40 odd years ago, it'd be particularly interesting for those of us who were still in nappies at the time. And give us a call on your most memorable moment from the 50 years of broadcasting that LBC is currently celebrating. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. Don't hold back. And I'll tell you something else as well. There was a lovely call with Nick from a chap called Charlie, I think, who said that his father was such an LBC addict that he passed away with us playing in the background. He didn't reveal which presenter was actually on duty at during his dad's final moments, but he said he never rang in. He wasn't the sort of person to ring in. And I thought, well, what is the sort of person to ring in? But this is one of those hours where if you're not the sort of person to ring in, whatever that means, then you could actually ring in. This could be one of those moments where you don't really, it's certainly not going to be a scrap, is it? Or you don't have to have a dog in the fight, as it were. You've just got a little memory of something that happened on your radio that tickled you pink. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. And we'll take whatever you've got, including contributors, presenters who I may not even be aware of. Everyone's done a shift here at some point in the last 50 years. Pretty much every presenter you've ever heard of. Michael Parkinson was in this slot for a while, not a very long while. Richard Littlejohn was in this slot for a while. But those of us who've had the privilege of really being able to keep you company for decades rather than years, sometimes need a little bit of a reminder about some of the other stuff. So we'll get the phone lines open. I shall risk going in on the texts, which I'll probably regret immediately. Nathan in Sheffield, kicked in the head by a horse. Nick Abbott every Friday and Saturday night, but on a serious note, he says the first call into Ian Dale's Drive Time show from an eyewitness to Lee Rigby's murder is something that I will never forget. An astonishing text in a way, Nathan, because you've managed to relay in 4 lines how much territory we can cover, how much we can do, the ups and the downs. 46 years ago, as an 8-year-old, I'd listened to LBC under the covers in bed, says Jason. Tommy Boyd was doing a show on words spelt by calculators when held upside down. And it's fair to say that the then LBC phone number provided much hilarity. I like that. Another one for the kick in the head by the horse. I think we'll probably park that one now. The angry Scotsman who rang in the day after Trump won and started talking about Obama and Clinton being the Obamas and the Clintons being the devils. We got the lovely lad in Leeds he was from Leeds, but he was living in China. Luke, his name was, who rang in a lot during lockdown. That's a nice one. There have been many good moments, James, but a particularly funny one was when Sheila was having a coughing fit during a call, yet the caller still badgered her, and she hung up on him. I don't think you'll find it anywhere, but she might remember, suggests Harge. Your interview, kebabbing with Ian Duncan Smith, that was back in the day. That was before the Farage one. And again, please play the interview. I don't think we'll be playing any clips because we've only just thought of doing this as a conversation. You'd think we'd have known. We've had 50 years to prepare for this. You'd have thought we might have got some clips prepared to look back upon some of our happier moments, or at least not necessarily happier, but some of our memorable moments. But the anonymous civil servant last year who was begging the government to act honourably. Crikey, you're right. I don't think that story's actually over yet. I think there are still some repercussions. And for me, James, says another James, it has to be your Brexit callers. Well, I owe them an enormous debt, actually. It certainly made a huge difference to my career, particularly the lady who complained that she could not have her fish and chips wrapped in newspaper anymore, despite it having nothing to do with the EU. Or when she complained about Wetherspoons still being able to buy drinks from outside the EU when we were still EU members. It is a fairly broad church of memory, which I look forward to exploring a little further with you shortly. The number you need, 0345 6060 973. Phone lines are open. And I just want to know, the Kebab Awards call it. These are all very recent. What's it called when, like, you do what are the top 50 albums and Robbie Williams comes in third? I love Robbie Williams, don't get me wrong, but there's no way that he has released the third finest album of all time. So there's quite a lot of The Kebab Awards call was pretty good, but I don't think it was... Actually, it was pretty good, wasn't it? It was pretty special. But I don't know that it would make the top 10 calls of all time. And it doesn't have to be calls, remember. Other shows still have a lot of guests. They can provide absolutely magical moments. Or it could be even... it'd be hard to explain a monologue, wouldn't it, as being one of the finest moments in the history of LBC. But I'd be more than happy to let you have a go. I'd be more than happy to let you try. Don't forget, you can text 84850. The bloke from Sandbach. Yes, I remember him. The UKipper from Sandbach. Seb says you barely held it together. But don't make it all about me. What about the lovely lady who we took to the opera? Do you remember that? That was quite recent. I can't. Her name eludes me. But we managed to sort her out with a trip to the English National Opera, who've got another wonderful show on at the moment, by the way, Iolanthe. All sorts. And this one with which I'm tempted to agree from Marion, almost anything Eddie Mair ever said would constitute a highlight of the last 50 years of LBC. So keep it clean, please. But other than that, anything goes, anything you want. Just 50 years celebration, the first ever commercial radio station in the United Kingdom, and somehow still going strong. It's 12:15.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
I could do this for weeks, it would appear. Pigeon accents from Jennifer. You had to be there. Indeed, all of these you'd have to be there. But, you know, Ian says the most memorable moment for me was the emotion in the presenter's voice when he announced that the Queen had passed away. That was Andrew, of course. That was Andrew Marr. And the guy says, Ben Estever, quite a few have mentioned this, that voted Brexit because there were too many brown people in his local supermarket is always a highlight for me, mainly because you were actually quite nice to him, James. Theo Osherwood nearly reducing Steve Bannon to tears, says Pez. I'm so glad that someone pulled his pants down, and on we go. Oh, mate, that's one of mine, actually, Emma in Ashfield. The guy who phoned you about the funeral. That was Shams in the city, I think. He'd had a funeral for his cat. I was laughing so much. So was I. That if we'd actually had this idea before 10 to 12 today, we probably would have got that one ready. I don't know where it would be in the archive, but that was astonishing, that call. Truly, I mean, wetting yourself territory. And at the other end of the scale, says Emma in Ashfield, your chat with Bill Browder. It was captivating, and goodness me, how that has served us well in the ensuing years as the threat that he described Vladimir Putin representing has come to frequent and horrible fruition. Let's go to Annette, who's in Kingston upon Thames. Annette, go on, what's your memory?
Hello.
Hello.
I've been listening for about 40 years, which ages me a bit.
40.
But in the late 80s and early 90s, I used to go home by cab from work in the evenings.
Yes.
And all of the cab drivers would have LBC on. And if they didn't, I'd ask them to switch it on.
Good,
and
thank you for that.
We always listened to Clive Ball, who was on earlier.
Of course.
Than he is now. And he had one particular caller who was also a cab driver. He was a black cab driver. And let's just say he wasn't the sharpest tool at the port. And I apologise if he's listening, but this was 40 years ago.
Yeah.
He tried to teach Clive a card trick over the phone. And Clive kept getting it wrong, and he was getting so frustrated. It went on for about half an hour, and I was crying. It was...
no one can do that.
You haven't got that clip, really, because I can't tell you what the trick even was now. But
no one can do that kind of thing quite like Clive can. I don't think.
He has lots of regulars, yeah.
Yeah, but also he has that ability to let the line spool out, you know, as if it were a fishing line, so that the fish just can go wherever it wants and do. I don't know that you can do that in the daylight hours. Sometimes the nighttime lends itself a bit to that kind of radio, doesn't it? Nick Abbott, also a master of the genre. I think it's fair to say. And of course, Peter Cook, thank you, Annette. That's a lovely sort of illustration of the way that we can reach parts that other radio cannot reach. I've just tuned in, says this text, that, are you leaving, James? No, this isn't a celebration of my... It's the 50th birthday of LBC, literally yesterday, and therefore an opportunity to look back over some of the happy moments. Sven, the Swedish fisherman, was actually Peter Cook. I found this hard to believe until someone played me the tapes. So Peter Cook, the comic legend, founder of Private Eye, Pete and Dud, Derek and Clive, although we won't be playing any of that out on the radio, used to phone Clive Bull in character as a Swedish fisherman. And Clive was in on the joke, but, that it's almost impossible to express the magic of that. Mike's in Weston. Mike, what made you pick up the phone?
Well, I've got so many memories of LBC. It's basically been just a part of my life since I was a kid. I remember sitting in my dad's car listening to Douglas Cameron do the breakfast show.
Yes, what a voice.
On the way into school. And so it was quite an amazing experience for me in the late 90s when I used to get invited on as a talking head on a regular Thursday night show that you had called The Lab. It was in the dark years between when LBC got moved off of FM. It was only on AM, so it didn't have very many listeners at the time.
It was a weird window, that, wasn't it? I'm not fully across it. I think I was still at school, but it was a strange period.
Yeah, it was really strange. Not many people knew that LBC even still existed. So
Yeah.
I used to tell people I'm going on LBC. They're like, "Oh, is that still on air? I didn't realise." But you had this sort of technology magazine show that was run by a couple of friends of mine because we were all in.
I don't know if you're allowed to ring in with yourself as your favourite LBC memory, Mike. I should perhaps have made this clearer. Otherwise, I could easily fill the hour without interruption.
Oh, fair enough. No, it wasn't actually me being on the radio.
No.
It was the excitement of me being invited into the studio and being able to. I think I had to set a tape recorder to record it at home so I could listen back.
I remember that. And that was a big part of what we did, wasn't it? Those kind of advice type stuff. When I started here, I was doing swing at weekends. I think we still had a gardening hour. People would ring in and ask for advice on what to do with their petunias.
Well, it was also very weird for me because I was very young at the time. I was in my early 20s, and to suddenly be treated like this expert that was supposed to know about everything and be, this voice of wisdom on the radio, it was all a little bit overwhelming. But then, fortunately, it went back onto FM a few years later, and along you came.
And along I came. Thank you very much, Mike. And the audience now is absolutely dwarfs what it was before. It's an astonishing achievement. And going national, of course, has been a glorious success. 23 minutes after 12 is the time. Rob's in Downham Market. Rob, what would you like to say? What made you pick up the phone?
Well, the LBC's birthday, of course. I've had so many memories over the years of the LBC. Many of them are not happy and horrific in some cases, but it's a happy one.
Yes.
I'm not your oldest listener, but I'm probably one of your longest on LBC. I was invited to your studios, I believe it was Gough Square.
Yeah, behind Fleet Street.
1974,
Blimey.
With a school party. It was to do with our English teacher at Burnt Mill Comprehensive in Hull. I'll get that plug in. And it was about a game that he'd invented where pupils played out in role play a council meeting. And in LBC, we actually just had an interview with one of your presenters at the time. I can't remember who it was, but it was in a downstairs basement studio, and it was so exciting for a 14-year-old boy. And the rest of us really enjoyed ourselves. Then we went on to a town hall somewhere, which I can't remember, for a photo shoot. And then we ended up on the Great Nationwide with Mike Barrett.
Good Lord. So you're doing another one where your favourite memory involves yourself.
Well, to be honest
this
with you,
isn't quite what I envisaged when I talked about ego at the beginning of this hour, Rob.
Well, I'm not quite up to your standards, but yeah, I'll be honest with you, it's only through going there that I actually knew of LBC.
Yeah, fair enough.
And it was recorded during the week, and they played it back in the morning, either on the following Saturday or Sunday. And I often wonder in the archives whether it still exists or the Nationwide.
Highly unlikely, mate. Absolutely no chance, actually, probably, is the more accurate answer.
No,
I think
I will say, like the gentleman earlier on the earlier show has had the radio on and he died listening to it.
Yeah.
Well, I put the LBC on when I go to bed. It's on all night, so if I wake up, I hear it. And it's on until I get up in the morning, and it's a godsend, absolute godsend.
I think we forget that sometimes, but it cuts both ways, especially during lockdown. I was really, really conscious of there being two ends of the conversation, that kind of weird period of broadcasting from a shed in my garden and feeling really oddly dislocated and isolated. I never felt that bond more strongly about the both ends of the broadcast, as it were. Thank you, Robert. Yes, when Ian Lee and me had a running race live on the radio, that was fairly memorable. And Rhys in Barnsley says, don't forget your rap. I'd love to forget my rap, Rhys, actually. J to the O to the O to the B. Marty's in Belfast. Marty, what would you like to say?
James, good afternoon.
Hello.
I've been listening to LBC since I think about 2016. 2015, 2016.
Okay. So you're quite a newcomer then, relatively speaking.
Relatively speaking. My most favourite moment is a very, very recent one, and it was your live fact-checking of Boris Johnson's resignation letter.
Yes.
I would have preferred a different presenter had done this slot, because I would have still picked this. I think it is one of the most epic bits of radio I've ever heard in my life.
Well,
brilliant.
That's incredibly kind of you, but there was an awful lot of material to work with. But I don't know if you heard Eddie Mair's sort of farewell takedown of Boris Johnson around the same time, which even my overextended ego doesn't quite stretch to denying was probably even better, Marty. I think that...
I must have a look for it, because I have rewatched your fact-checking of the letter, I would say, at least half a dozen times on YouTube.
Well, that's even more than I have. Thank you. I mean, crikey, there is always that slight worry about what we're going to do if rather than when politics returns to being a slightly more calm subject, where there is a little less meat to get our teeth into on a regular basis, going back really to the referendum and possibly even beyond. But goodness me, the choppy waters that we've had to navigate in the last 10 years, at least, probably the choppiest of the entire 50. Thank you, Marty. That was very kind of you. Jeremy Beadle was great on LBC. Must have been around the late 70s, early 80s. He must have had an A to Z, because he often suggested he knew people in roads from the area that they called up in. He also did one of the biggest pranks ever, I think, in radio, and pretended that he was broadcasting the entire show from the London Underground, which would be technically impossible. But Beadle, who I didn't listen to, I only really knew him from Game for a Laugh and Beadle's About later. He was on here when I was still in short trousers living in Kidderminster, but the legend lives on. And he did a thing where he had a producer called Bavin, who was still spoken of in hushed tones when I started here. And he did the entire show pretending to be on the London Underground, to the point where people were waiting for him at stations, because he was doing it all in real time. Is it right? We're now going from South Kensington to Gloucester Road. People were waiting for him at stations, and I think Transport for London got the hump, and they kind of had to warn about disruption, because the people turning up at stations in the hope of seeing Jeremy Beadle presenting the programme from a tube train. When he was back in the studio, he was in the normal studio. It was all completely manufactured and invented, but the levels of creativity involved in that were astonishing. And I've just remembered of something a bit embarrassing for me. Do you remember when the Beagle got lost in space? Do you remember that? There was a scientist, and Alex James from Blur was involved in it. Was it Mars? They sent a probe to Mars called the Beagle, and it got lost, or they lost contact with the Beagle. It was quite a big story at the time, about 10 years ago. So I thought this would be hilarious. I phoned Jeremy Beadle and asked him if I would do something live on the radio trying to make contact with the Beagle that was lost on Mars. And he'd come on the line and say hello, and we'd have a moment of comedy during which it would emerge that I'd actually accidentally got hold of the Beadle as opposed to the Beagle. And I thought that was really funny. And I get a bit self-conscious or insecure sometimes when I'm talking to big cheeses. So I plucked up the courage to ring him, and I ran it by him. I think I did, or did the producer do it on speakerphone? Anyway, I can't remember. His response was, "Oh no, I think that sounds a bit naff, really." And we were crushed. We were crushed. We thought we'd come up with a brilliant treatment worthy of the great LBC prankster himself, but he thought it was rubbish. Thank you for the memory, David. You're right. I think he did have an A to Z in the studio. So you'd ring in and say, "It's whereabouts in Uxbridge?" Oh yes, right. So do you know Keith on Acacia Avenue? And you'd just be leafing through the A to Z.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
12:34 is the time. We're not going to touch the sides, are we, on this one? We're really not. A couple of mentions of my old mate Theo Usherwood, actually, which is a mark of the impression he made during his time here. Ben says hearing Theo's voice after he'd recovered from his, you say near-death fight with COVID, it was actually that grim, wasn't it? And we were all so worried about him. I think that's the closest I came to cracking up on air. And then we welcomed him back. And Jane replies with, my favourite ever moment was with two of my favourite people, Theo and Eddie Mayer, when Theo's little boy interrupted the live broadcast. Was he flooding the house or something like that? He turned on the hose. What? He had the garden. He was flooding the garden. I missed them both. You and me both, Jane. Christoph's in Wembley Park. Christoph, what would you like to say?
Well, mine are about Clive Bull, and I actually wonder whether I haven't been the victim of his incredible subtlety. Because, I mean, when you worked out, when you became in the know,
yes,
and you think, he just... Anyway, my two are... Clive Bull used to have this competition where he used to play a country's national anthem, and people had to ring in to try and work, and say which country it was. And there was a lady called Alicia from Bloomsbury, and she almost always rang in every week and guessed correctly. And other listeners would ring in. And then about 2 years after this, I kind of found this CD which had the national anthems of all the countries on it. Obviously Clive and Alicia both had this CD, and my other Clive Bull one, and this is where I really wonder, am I really the victim of Clive? But where I think it must have been the late 80s, 3 or 4 in the morning, Clive received a call, and it was from Frank Zappa.
Oh, yeah.
Now, do you remember Frank Zappa?
Of course I remember Frank Zappa, father of Dweezil and Moon Unit.
Yeah. And the thing is that I don't know whether this was on purpose or what, but it appeared that Clive Bull didn't really know who he was. He just treated him exactly like he would treat any other caller. And I was going to think, come on, don't you know who this guy is? And I can't remember what they were talking about or what the subject was, because I was just like, Clive, how can you be reacting like this to Frank Zappa?
How remarkable. I mean, why was he ringing in? Was he here on tour, or do we know?
Yeah,
can you remember?
I don't know. I have no idea. Well, because Clive didn't ask him about that, you see. Clive didn't say, why are you in London then, Frank? Or
didn't even do that.
Like that.
But that's Clive in a nutshell, isn't it? The most supremely unruffleable man in the history of the world. I didn't know, Christoph, that my friend Kira was with Peter Cook when he used to ring in doing Sven. She was working for him. She says, she's texted me to say, I used to sit next to him when he was calling LBC. I was only 18 or 19 years old. He also did a character, I think, called E.L. Wisty. It's all in Harry Thompson's. Yes. It's all in Harry Thompson's biography of Cook, of Peter Cook. Amazing, really, how it gets into your brain, isn't it? And continues to do so. Thank you, Christoph. I like that. 12:37 is the time. Ian's in Birmingham. Ian, what would you like to say? Is Ian in Birmingham, or is he in up there? I love that. You can't have a tribute to 50 years of LBC without a line going down. Did you do that on purpose, Ian?
I did, yeah, definitely.
Very good,
we're going
thank
to go
you.
with that, right?
Perfect stuff. Look at that for off-the-cuff creativity live on your radio. What would you like to say, mate?
Eddie Mayer did a series of interviews with Steve Hewlett after he got diagnosed with esophageal cancer.
That was on Radio 4.
No, it was it?
Yeah.
Oh, God.
I mean, that's absolutely fine. We're not the only radio station in the world.
I followed Eddie Mayer to LBC, so I'm just terrible at timescales.
No, that's absolutely fine. You're obviously one of the people that Eddie brought with him when he came over from Radio 4.
Nice to be here.
But that didn't happen on LBC.
Well, all right then. In that case,
other night?
You just being
thank you,
naughty little schoolboy with Theo every single time you spoke to him.
Yeah, it's nice to see Theo getting so much love. Quite a few people picking up on that. Thank you, Ian. And it was incredible radio, and the late Steve Hewlett, of course, a legend in his own right. But just one of the many reasons why Eddie was a one-off, is still a one-off. He's not dead. He's just semi-retired. It is 12:38. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC, and 50 years into LBC's remarkable story. Just a brief pause to reflect upon some of your most memorable moments, and it could really go on forever. It really could. Will's in Ascot. Will, what would you like to say?
Yeah, hi, James. No, just a bit of a personal anecdote. So, growing up sort of 10, 11 years old, my mum always used to have you on in the car. And we kind of had a game in my brother where we would listen to you and your kind of amazing, extensive vocabulary. And our game was to kind of pick a word each day that we didn't know, look up, and then try and use it in our homework. And I remember quite distinctly one day my English teacher picking me out in front of the class saying how amazing some of the words I was using just from
I'll
listening
take
to
all
you.
the credit. I'll take all the credit for that, Will. All the
No,
credit.
It was, really good fun. And now, I just kind of relate to you quite a lot. Like,
thank you, mate.
Growing up, similar sort of dad as yours, childhood-wise, went to private school, now at LSE, your alma mater. And just you kind of inspired my love of English.
It's very lovely. Absolutely lovely thing to say. It really is, and I appreciate it. And what a clever mum you've got as well. And there I love doing that. We nearly did Word of the Day at one point, but Susie Dent does such a sterling job of it on Twitter that there's no point us joining in. She also knows way more words than I ever will. And Susie is the guest on this week's Full Disclosure, actually. So if you do share me and Will, or my and Will's enthusiasm for new words, then or new to us, not neologisms, but words that are new to you, then the Susie Dent interview on Full Disclosure this week is an absolute joy. Ian Dale masterfully setting Liz Truss up to confirm that she'd also changed her mind about Brexit. That was Eddie Mair. That wasn't Ian. Ian's done some sterling broadcasting over the years, but that exchange with Liz Truss, with Eddie, was like, people haven't changed their minds about Brexit. And then he said, here it is. Steve sent it in, actually, would you believe? I'll just share it with you now. Eddie Mair interviewed Liz Truss about Brexit in 2018. Eddie said, what about all the people who've changed their minds? And she said, I don't think people have changed their minds. And he said, well, you've changed your mind. You know, really, that was a very early indication of what we could expect from Liz Truss when she became Prime Minister. People haven't changed their minds. Well, you've changed your mind. And then there's a pause, and there's just I have, that's true. I found the cat funeral tape, but it's quite long, and I don't actually know. I don't know if it's going to live up to expectations. Let's talk to Henry Riley first, LBC's reporter, who is at the Labour Party conference in Liverpool, where Rachel Reeves has just completed her speech. Henry, what did you make of it all?
That's right, around 40 minutes or so we heard from the Shadow Chancellor, ready to serve, ready to lead, ready to rebuild Britain. She used that phrase on 5 or 6 occasions, and I think I have to say it's probably the best speech Labour members have heard from Rachel Reeves. She delivered some of it looking straight down the barrel of the camera, addressing voters, but then a lot of it was sort of playing up to the hall as well. There were some very funny moments. She was saying that she supports the government's smoking ban, but with a shortage of fag packets, what on earth are they going to write their next policy on, which got a bit of a cheer in the audience. Liz Truss might be out of Downing Street, but she's still leading the Conservative Party, and she referenced Liz Truss's name on a few occasions, and it went down understandably very well with members. They were saying, she said, never again will we allow a repeat of the devastation that Liz Truss and the Tories inflicted on family finances. But actually, James, the biggest cheer of the whole speech, really, the whole 40 minutes, was when she reiterated Labour's policy to close the tax loophole which exempts private schools from paying VAT and business rates. That got, I think, the biggest cheer of the conference so far.
Interesting. The polling suggests that as well, actually. I don't know if you saw it this weekend, but it's almost as if the Labour Party is a little bit closer to public opinion than newspaper columnists and pundits. Remind us what the forthcoming highlights are, Henry.
Yes, well, by the way, Jim, just to add something I forgot to mention is the overspill for Rachel Reeves' speech was absolutely huge. So firstly, the main conference hall was about double the size in terms of capacity what the Conservatives had.
Oh, really?
And that was filled out. Oh, and it was busy. I mean, there were people waiting for 40 minutes before the speech. So they were there with their sort of Labour membership cards at 11:20, and they didn't get in. It was so busy, and there are various overspill rooms. And actually, if you tot up all the overspill rooms, including where I was watching it, because I didn't get in, I only got there half an hour before, I was turned away. It was more than, I think, a lot of the Conservative speeches from last week. So the overspill rooms actually had more people listening to Rachel Reeves than Mark Harper last week, to give you one name, because his event was perhaps one of the less well attended.
So more people in the overspill rooms for Rachel Reeves than there were in the actual hall for Mark Harper?
Undoubtedly.
Is that what
undoubtedly.
You're saying?
It's a huge event. I mean, it was really sort of, if this is Glastonbury, Rachel Reeves is the Mick Jagger.
Let's not get
really
carried
like
away. What does that make Keir
atmosphere.
Starmer then?
Well, I would say
Jay-Z?
Phil Collins, but
The mind boggles.
My knowledge of Jay-Z.
Keir Starmer, I know, we haven't got time to go through the greatest hits of Genesis. Keir Starmer on stage tomorrow, he'll presumably expect an even bigger response, an even bigger crowd.
He will, and it's a huge speech for Sir Keir Starmer, really, and this is going to be a massive moment for his premiership. I understand that he's going to really focus on 5 missions that he's set out. There are various ones from growth to healthcare and for having a greener future. He's going to really turn, from what I understand, James, what he's going to seek to do tomorrow is turn those missions, which you speak to sources in the Labour Party, they do accept that they are fairly perhaps tenuous, they haven't really got a sort of a clear directive in terms of a policy outcome. What Sir Keir Starmer's going to do tomorrow, I understand, is really turn those missions into policy. So expect to see a lot of substance. It's often levied at Sir Keir Starmer that really they haven't come up with enough policies, and he will argue, well, we're still some way out from an election, and he doesn't want the Conservatives perhaps looking at any of those policies in a favourable way and taking them on themselves. But tomorrow, all about substance, really. We're going to hear a lot about Keir in terms of his private life, in terms of his backstory. Personal life, that is often what we hear at these party conferences, so expect a lot of that. But really, speaking with sources last night, it's going to be a lot of meat on the bone. If they're going to end this line that really you don't know what Sir Keir Starmer stands for, he's going to be very upfront, very clear on what his priorities for a Labour government are, and expect to hear those same words that Rachel Reeves uttered: ready to serve, ready to govern. They really are presenting themselves as that government in waiting.
But are they ready to stand up and fight?
Well, we haven't heard any of that yet. Penny Mordaunt isn't here, but I'll let you know if she wanders in.
We'll have to wait and see. Henry Riley live from Liverpool, where, as you hear, as you know, the Labour Party are having their annual conference. We, meanwhile, back in London, are celebrating 50 years of LBC by reflecting upon some of our most felicitous memories, or indeed most moving memories, on the question of that anniversary. I don't know. I'll take advisement during the next junction on whether or not we play out the whole 6 minutes of the cat funeral call, which I thought was the essence, in a way, of the magic that sometimes appears on your radio without anyone planning it or being able to predict it or knowing that it's going to happen.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
10 to 1 is the time. Mike says, I won't get on air with this because I've already been on once this hour, but I have a very clear memory of sitting outside my office, unable to get out of my car because I was listening to Frank Lampard call in to hold you to account. And he adds, that and the time I bumped into you in Covent Garden and you didn't have the foggiest who I was. I remember both events. I think it's the only Sony Award I ever won. Was for that, frankly, bizarre Frank Lampard conversation, to which there is a postscript that I will never be able to share, I don't think, until I write my memoirs. 10 to 1 is the time, 50 years in. Please, 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 please play the cat funeral, says Jamie in Cumbria, whereas Jackie confines herself to just 2 pleases. Please, please, cat funeral. It was the funnest. I think we will, but we'll take 1 or 2 more calls first. Ali's in Dartford. Ali, what can you remember? What's your happy memory? Or
James.
Yeah.
Sorry. Hello. I just want to remind you of Gary from Quiz of the Week. Do you remember Gary?
What did he do?
Oh, the guy who just would not answer your question. You kept asking to mention the name of an actor, living or dead, and you kept saying an Australian.
Yeah.
Oh, do you know, I still play it today, James. I still play it. Every now and again I have to play it because it's hilarious.
It was surreal, wasn't it?
Funny,
it would be impossible to believe that it wasn't actually scripted, but he was for real. He was completely for real.
What I said.
The Quiz of the Week.
Researcher. I said, oh no, she said, what was it? Whose show was it on? I said, it was on James's show, Quiz of the Week. I thought, my God, I'm old, aren't I?
I don't think she was born. I'm not sure she was born when we did that. That's how old we are now. That was my second favourite. Do you know what my favourite was on Quiz of the Week?
What was that?
It was a lady rang in, an older lady, and the question was, how many kings of England have been called Henry? And she went, oh, well, she said, I know there was Henry V. And she said, and there was Henry VIII, wasn't there, James? And she went, is it 3?
Brilliant, isn't it?
I mean, it is actually. I thought that was priceless, but we are going to, in the spirit of the days when we were perhaps a tiny bit less serious. Well, the world was a less serious place back then. Well, I'll just let it take care of itself, but it is quite long.
A cat, family pet of 13 years, fell ill, had cancer.
Yeah.
We took it to the vets. The insurance had lapsed for one reason or another, because whilst my wife was pregnant, the insurance was under her name, which she forgot. So it's one of those things.
Yeah.
The insurance had lapsed. So suffice to say, we ended up paying probably about £6,000-7,000 for all the chemotherapy, the scans, and everything. to give him probably about 9 months of life.
I remember, yes, I do remember now.
Okay, so...
£6,000 or £7,000, so about £1,000 a month, give or take.
Yes.
Because of the kids, right?
Yeah, for the kids and also for my wife. My wife and I are in a fortunate position. We're in well-paid jobs. It would have been hypocritical for us to be spending thousands on our hobbies and not on what we saw was a family member.
Yeah.
Okay, so even to the point where when the cat was due to be put down, because the vet had got to know us so well, he came round and did put him to sleep at home, as opposed to in a clinical environment of a surgery.
Yes.
Anyway, so now it comes around to the funeral, and I don't know. I mean, I've spoken to you several times, James, and you're an evangelical atheist. It was difficult for me to say to my children, look, we're going to bury the cat and the cat's going to go to catty heaven. I couldn't. It was just so hypocritical for me. So I thought, okay, what's the best way we can do this?
Yeah.
We thought, okay, we can cremate the cat, take him out to sea, let the ashes then go up with the atmosphere. So I could explain to the kids, look, he's atoms and he's everywhere you are. Every time it rains, every time you breathe, he's with you. You don't have to have this. He hasn't gone to catty heaven, but he's everywhere. His atoms are everywhere. He's gone up in with the air currents, etc. Yeah, with the atmosphere. Sorry. So that was my way of trying to.
How did that work out for you?
Very well, because I'll tell you at the end. Anyway, so I'm travelling. I travel quite extensively for my job.
Yeah.
And my wife says she will organise the funeral. So I said fine. So for the cat.
Yeah, right.
So the cat has been taken after the cat was put down. The cat was taken away by the.
What was the cat called? Can we give it a name? I feel it's all a bit anonymous.
Jojo.
Poor old Jojo.
James, please do not try and speak up because it's not.
Mate, I'm not. I'm with you, mate. I don't know how I'm holding it together. Go on with the story, seriously. Poor little Jojo.
Jojo was taken away by the vet and was cremated and was sent back in a ethical, recyclable container that would dissolve in water eventually.
Right. A cardboard box.
So my wife, a cardboard box that costs £300.
An ethical, decomposable, what's the word? What do they call it? Stuff that decomposes in the biodegradable box. Yeah, all right, carry on. 300 quid, I saw you coming. Carry on, Sam.
So my wife's called me. I'm working on, and my wife's called me and said, look, I've organised a funeral. It's going to be this Saturday. It's in Brighton.
Where do you live?
In Waltham Abbey. So he said, that's good.
What's it got to do with Brighton? Wait, sorry.
Brighton is a place we go quite often as a family.
Okay.
It's the nicest. It's a nice area. Brighton's.
Yeah, I know.
Been in Brighton.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I said, didn't think anything of it. The Saturday comes, so we all drive down to Brighton, a family of 4, with the cat in the ethical recyclable box.
Yeah.
We turn up at Brighton Marina. We eventually find this boat. Now, this boat, I was thinking it was going to be a dinghy, one man in his dinghy, with a little GPS device, because apparently he will mark the corners where you laid him to rest and then provide that to you.
With like a matter grid reference, as it were.
Yes.
That's nice.
Yes.
That's nice.
So I'm James. I can hear the.
Oh, no, you can't, mate. Seriously, no, you can't. I've changed.
So I'm thinking it's going to be one man and his dog and a dinghy. Turned up, and it's a proper funeral boat.
No way.
That holds about 40 people.
Oh.
So we turned up. There's 4 of us and this box. And the guy said to me, look, no funeral parlour's got in touch with me about picking up the body. I take it the body's coming later. I went to tell her, I said, no, the body's with us.
Brought it in a box.
It is. And he's looked at us as if to say, hang on, you sure? There's 4 of you and a cat.
So what? So has your wife not mentioned she'd managed to book a barge, a funeral barge, a floating hearse, without mentioning that it was not a human that you were saying?
No. Because she do everything online. She did it all online. She hadn't actually spoken to the guy. I tried my best. I mean, I tried my best not to snigger. I can see the funny side now, but it was a very, very, how can I put it? Not spiritual. Spiritual is the wrong word, but for the kids, it was a nice way for them to say, yeah, it worked. Because the following day when it rained, the first thing is my kids said, look, we want to go outside and stand outside in the rain because we want to be close to Jojo.
Oh, mate, that's just lovely. And I have been sniggering, but I'm not going to snigger at that. That's you know, that's why you did it. Had the captain done any other cats?
Sorry?
Had the captain of the boat ever done a cat before?
No, I think but the thing was, because it's biodegradable box, we put it out at sea, but it took 35 minutes for it to sink. So we sat there for 35 minutes. I shouldn't be laughing. James, you're so bad.
I can't believe the cat wasn't called Bob.
James, it's not funny.
No, I know it's not. And what was all in? How much did it set you back the day? Leaving aside the petrol to Brighton and stuff, just for the service, the ceremony.
Probably about £1,000. It was £850 for the boat. Then obviously the degradable thing was about 200, but 2-3. I don't know. My wife.
Job done. It took me ages to remember what that phone-in was about, actually, but it was about excessive amounts of money spent on pets, which I would approach very differently now. That was about 7 or 8 years ago, since when I've become a dog owner. But it just goes to show, and a little bit of light relief from the very serious news that we have spent the first 2 hours of the programme contemplating, and to which Sheila will be returning imminently. If you did miss any of today's show, you can listen back on Catch Up on Global Player, rewind live radio, or enjoy the whole show podcast. You'll also find all of LBC shows there to catch up on, as well as your opportunity to stay up to date with the latest news from LBC. Rewind live radio on Global Player. Download it for free from your app store or head to globalplayer.com. Tom Swarbrick will be with you at 4, but now it's time for Sheila Fogarty.
Thank you very much, James.
James O'Brien on LBC.